For service.
But yeah, I sent a whole ton of staff there.
Excuse me, speakers. This is Shelby, your operator. I'm showing that there are no participants or members of the public that are dialed into the conference.
Shelby,
Yes, ma'am?
it's okay. Leave the line open, please. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. I was just wanting to know if you would like to start right at the start time or give everyone a chance to dial in.
You can go ahead and
for
connect it for now.
I'm sorry?
You can connect it now.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. And would you like me to go ahead and read my opening script and then turn it over to Chair Catherine Lehman?
You may.
Yes, ma'am. Here we go.
Thank you.
Good day and welcome to the Commission briefing meeting. At this time, I would like to turn the conference over to Chair Catherine Lehman. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you, operator.
Yes, ma'am.
Button, the red light comes on, turn it off.
Okay, this briefing of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights comes to order at 9 a.m. Eastern Time on February 22nd, 2019, and takes place at the Commission headquarters at 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Suite 1150, Washington, D.C. 20425. I'm Chair Catherine Lehman, and commissioners present at this briefing in addition to me are the Vice Chair, Patricia Timmons-Goodson, Commissioner Degbele, Commissioner Harriet, Commissioner Kirsanow, Commissioner Chladni, Commissioner Narasaki, and Commissioner Yaki. A quorum of the commissioners is present. Will the court reporter confirm for the record that you are present? Thank you. Mr. Staff Director, will you confirm for the record that you are present?
I am present.
Thank you. I welcome everyone to our briefing on women in prison seeking justice behind bars. In today's briefing, the Commission examines through a civil rights lens the experience and condition of confinement for women in prison. The topics we examine include access to care for women's medical needs, the deprivation of which may violate the constitutional requirement to provide adequate medical care for all prisoners, implementation of the Prison Rape Elimination Act and other efforts to prevent sexual violence perpetrated on women in prison, and the sufficiency of programs to meet women's needs after release. The Commission will examine the consequences of discipline practices in women's prisons and the impact on families when women are placed far from home or parental rights are terminated despite their caregiving role. We will hear from women who have experienced incarceration, state and federal corrections officials, academic and legal experts, and advocates. Testimony from this briefing will form an integral basis for the Commission's eventual report to the President, Congress, and the American people, in which we will offer recommendations regarding adequate safeguards for the civil rights of incarcerated women. Today's briefing features more than 20 distinguished speakers who will provide us with an array of viewpoints, as well as the opportunity to hear from the public. Panel 1 will be a substantive overview of our broad topic regarding women in prison, examining statistics, constitutional protections, classification, and family disruption. Panel 2 will analyze women's health, personal dignity, and sexual abuse in the U.S. prison system. Panel 3 will review treatment of women while incarcerated. Panel 4 will examine rehabilitative opportunities for women in prison and life after prison. The day will conclude with an open public comment session during which the Commission will hear from members of the public who wish to present additional information to the Commission. I thank all who join us today to focus on this critical topic. Your views help us to fulfill our mission to be the nation's eyes and ears on civil rights. And I will now turn to Commissioner Dave Chladni, who leads this investigation for the Commission.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Justice Kennedy said, when a prisoner is taken away, our attention turns to the next case. When the door is locked against a prisoner, we do not think about what is behind it. And where we enter the hidden world of punishment, we should not be startled by what we see. One day in prison is longer than any day you and I have ever had to endure. Women in prison face overarching issues which cause great harm while they are incarcerated. These issues continue to cause harm after they're released, and addressing these issues is not at the forefront of government action or policies. Today's briefing contextualizes many of the issues facing women in prison in one place. I hope this consolidation of issues will lead to change in an archaic system of imprisonment which succeeds in punishment but fails in the ability of any meaningful rehabilitation which increases the public safety. Incarcerated women who have never abused their kids have them taken away at higher rates for the sole reason of being incarcerated than parents who physically abuse their children. Women have different needs than men. They require annual physical examinations and screenings, which they don't receive and endangers their lives. Basic fairness demands that they have the same educational and vocational opportunities that men do, but they do not. The most effective policies for good public work would be to provide programs which actually prepare these women for financial and social success on the outside. We must examine legal issues like gender-specific staffing assignments, consistent with Title VII through the use of bona fide occupational qualifications. We must also investigate the level of medical care necessary to fulfill Eighth Amendment requirements. Doing time is difficult enough. It is acknowledged by prison professionals that women are traumatized to a much greater degree than men when entering prison. They should not be further traumatized, degraded, disciplined, or assaulted because of their gender. We can and should protect the rights of any citizen of the United States, whether they are incarcerated or not. I am proud the Commission is proceeding with this briefing today, and I would like to thank former Commissioner Roberta Achtenberg for asking me to co-sponsor this topic when she served on the Commission. I also wish to thank Amy Royce, LaShonda Brenson, Kathy Cullerton Gonzalez, Elizabeth Poxtis, Maureen Rudolph, Tina Louise Martin, Pam Dunstan, Brian Walsh, and Ruku Singla, and our staff director, Mauro Morales. I also thank the witnesses who will participate today in this very rarely discussed topic. Many others made great contributions as well. As you may have heard, we had a government shutdown, but our staff managed to pull this event together nonetheless. I greatly appreciate their diligence, dedication, and hard work. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Gladney, and I echo your thanks to our staff and to all present who have been able to come together in these short weeks following the government shutdown. It's incredibly important for all of us. Now turning to some specifics for the briefing, I caution all speakers, including our commissioners, to refrain from speaking over each other for ease of transcription and to allow for sign language translation. To my right, for any individuals who may need to view the sign language translation, there are seats available in clear view. I ask everyone present to please silence your phones and not to take flash photos to minimize health risk to persons present. And as I mentioned, after the 4 panels and an afternoon break, we will reconvene at 5 p.m. for a public comment period. If you're interested in participating in the public comment period, during which each person will have up to 3 minutes to present, we will be honored to hear from you. In total, spots at the public comment period are allotted on a first-come, first-served basis. If you did not already sign up for one of the first 15 spots online, you may sign up at the registration desk now. The spots will be available until filled, and if you are one of the individuals who signed up online, please check in at the front desk so we hold your spot. For any member of the public who would like to submit materials for our review, our public record will remain open until Monday, March 25th, 2019. Materials can be submitted by mail to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, Office of Civil Rights Evaluation, 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest, Suite 1150, Washington, D.C. 20425, or by email to womeninprison@usccr.gov. During the briefing, each panelist will have 7 minutes to speak, and after each panel presentation, commissioners will have the opportunity to ask questions within the allotted period of time, and I will recognize commissioners who wish to speak. I will strictly enforce the time allotments given to each panelist to present his or her statement, and unless you are the one person who did not submit your testimony until today, you may assume we have read your statement, so you do not need to use your time to read them to us as your opening remarks, and please focus your remarks on the topic of our briefing. I note we have a very tight schedule because of the nearly 24 experts we have planning to present to us. So I ask my fellow commissioners to be cognizant of the interest of each commissioner to ask questions. Please be brief in asking your questions so we can move quickly and efficiently through today's schedule, and I will step in to move things along if necessary. Given the topic that can come up with regard to women in prison, I want to inform the panelists and the public and remind my fellow commissioners that since 1983, Congress has prohibited the Commission from, quote, studying and collecting or, quote, serving as a clearinghouse for any information with respect to abortion. Please tailor your remarks accordingly, consistent with this statutory restriction. Panelists, please notice the system of warning lights that we have set up. When the light turns from green to yellow, that means 2 minutes remain for your speaking time. When the light turns red, panelists should conclude your statements so you don't risk my cutting you off mid-sentence, which I will do. My fellow commissioners and I will do our part to keep our questions and comments concise. So now, with that, we turn to our first panel, which is titled an Overview of Women in Prison, Statistics, Constitutional Protections, Classification, and Family Disruption. The order in which they will speak is Dr. Alex McLaren, National Administrator, Women and Special Population Branch, Federal Bureau of Prisons; Caitlin Owens, Policy Analyst, the American Conservative Union; Dr. Emily J. Salisbury, Associate Professor of Criminal Justice, University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I understand you traveled late last night. Thank you for showing up early this morning, West Coast time. Emily Mooney, Criminal Justice Policy Associate, R Street Institute; and Pamela Wynn, Founder and Executive Director, Restore Her. Dr. McLaren, please begin. And I should say, thank you, turn on your microphone.
Good morning. Thank you for convening such an important event. In my capacity as the administrator for the Women and Special Populations Branch in our nation's largest correctional agency, I spend my days attending to the data on incarcerated women, implementing programs for incarcerated women, and ensuring the Federal Bureau of Prisons continues to meet the needs of incarcerated women. All that's to say I'm grateful to be part of this. My written statement details our programs, so today I'll summarize and talk about what else we can do with what we know. My comments are based on my experience as a clinical psychologist, a federal law enforcement officer, and a correctional practitioner. While I've published research on corrections, it's my time actually working in prisons that I hope adds context and value. I wish to make 2 key points: that because women and men are not the same, they require varied services, and that the Bureau has a number of gender-responsive practices that should be considered for replication. First, I'll repeat this statement: women and men are not the same. It's really that simple. We're all human and therefore we share commonalities, but women are different. And while the differences apply outside of prison, they may be magnified in correctional settings where facilities are divided by gender. Contrasting male versus female is not to put women in a box. There's incredible variation between individuals, and women aren't all alike. But again, women and men are different. Decades of study have helped us hone in not just on what those differences are, but why they're important. Women have higher rates of victimization and co-occurring psychiatric disorders, but lesser criminal histories. Relational issues are critical. These differences matter because to provide the best rehabilitative or even just habilitative services to women in prison, we have to understand how they got there. We need to be familiar with phenomena like the sexual assault to prison pipeline so we know how to intervene. If we want prison to be a corrective, healing experience, then we need to present women with programs designed for them. We can address women's criminogenic needs and remain trauma-informed. Some aspects of prison will be the same for all. People will be assessed upon arrival, for example, but we can and do use different classification models for this assessment. To properly address women's needs, we have to offer different structure from the ground up managing their incarceration. For much of the time we've had prisons, management approaches, the actual institutions, and all the programs in them have been designed in a one-size-fits-all fashion, and that size is male. It makes sense because the typical inmate's always been male, and while some systems have seen growth in their female population, the federal system hasn't, so 93% of inmates are still male. But we know that programs made for women or those that are gender neutral yield positive outcomes. Similarly, we know that women-centered management approaches engender better responses, and we can do these things without taking anything away from men. A holistic approach that includes training, management, and programmatic practices specific to women's needs is effective, and the Bureau offers an excellent model of this. In our organizational structure, we have a headquarters-based office that oversees women's issues and provides guidance to staff. We have general correctional training, but also training specific to women's needs. We have laws, such as the Prison Rape Elimination Act for all, but also policies that prescribe trauma-informed and gender-responsive procedures for women. We offer programs that any inmate can enroll in, but we add to that an ever-growing menu of interventions that were made just for women. I'll use the remainder of my time to talk about how we move forward with actionable items that make the best use of resource and expertise. With regard to family disruption, women's roles as mothers and caretakers are well documented. If women are more likely the main providers for children before arrest, we can surmise a disparate impact after arrest. There are publications on how women and children are affected by incarceration and separation, and it's not pretty. While prison systems are not in positions to address sentencing, there is a good deal we do to maintain mother-child bonds. They're nurtured via regular contact, in-person visits, but also phone and video, parenting programs, and partnerships with community organizations. Programs that allow women to live with their babies are also important. To determine what more to do, we have to look at women as real people. I've provided treatment to women dealing with the wrenching pain of missing their kids, but I've also worked with women who abuse their children or do not see them as a priority. We cannot address only the mothers who fit our conception of what a mother should be. We have to address them all. I always have beds available in my programs for pregnant women, so at least in the federal system, access or capacity is not the problem. Let's try to learn what's so broken that some women have no interest in these services. Some testimony today will likely address the system, but the system is just people. Women who serve time are people, and staff too are people. Many of them go above and beyond every single day to innovate and help and care. Sound bites from celebrities are helpful reminders of issues, but those who work in prisons understand nuances that must guide the solutions, such as the delicate balance of safety and security with treatment and reentry, and of best practices with resource realities. The Bureau and other correctional agencies are here at the table because we want to engage. A tendency is often to focus on flaws in the system, and that's important. But remember, I'm a psychologist, and we can't make change if we don't recognize there's a problem. So while we can learn from the past, we cannot use past issues as representations of what is going on today. Those are indicators of progress. For example, the Bureau restricts use of restraints on pregnant inmates and enhanced availability of free feminine hygiene products. I hope we recognize the many things that have changed and are working, and we take those initiatives, like our female integrated treatment program in Danbury, and we hold them up for expansion. I also ask that we take a look what we do outside of prison. Certainly, transitional resources, including safe, family-friendly housing, help women succeed after prison. But we're remiss if we do not look at what happens before prison. Prisons are among the largest mental health providers in our country. If women had greater access to treatment before they entered prison, would fewer of them become incarcerated? We survey women in Bureau custody. Responding women reported greater access to self-improvement programs in prison than on the outside. And last, we need more evidence-based programs for women to ensure their needs and rights are addressed and protected. We need to evaluate our current programs. We need basic research telling us more about subsections of the female population. We need more vocational options in non-traditional fields. And we need sustained interest and engagement that includes correctional practitioners. Thank you so very much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. McLaren. Ms. Owens?
Thank you so much for having me. I represent the American Conservative Union as a policy analyst. So thank you for holding this important hearing, and I hope my testimony is helpful to this commission in finding ways to uphold the dignity of incarcerated women. Women's needs are quite different from men, yet they serve their sentences designed for men, staffed primarily by men. As a result, many walk out of the gates in worse shape than when they entered. It's not just the inmate that gets punished. Communities diminish, families suffer, and taxpayers are burdened. The truth is that 95% of inmates will eventually return into society. So it's our job to make sure that the prisons and jails are well equipped to rehabilitate and correct, and not solely just punish. Prior to incarceration, women are 3 times more likely than men to be the primary caretaker of children. Roughly 65,000 incarcerated women were mothers of 147 minor children. Considering there are only 28 federal women's prisons as opposed to 83 prisons for men, women are disproportionately sent farther away from homes. Additionally, 11% of incarcerated mothers reported that their children had to be placed in foster care because they were not able to take care of their children just because they were incarcerated, as opposed to 2% of men. The Adoption and Safe Families Act requires termination of parental rights after a child spends 15 to 22 months in foster care, effectively guaranteeing the loss of their children. And the mother's prison term is 19 to 20 months, so they're almost guaranteed to lose their children. Access to visits and calls with loved ones help maintain a healthy mental state while behind bars, and those who received visitors are 13% less likely to recidivate. This shows us that close relationships with one's children and family members can ease an individual's transition back into society and reinforce motivation for change. Approximately 1,500 incarcerated women give birth in prison each year. Given this alarming number, it's shocking that only 22 states and the District of Columbia have a policy or legislation that they've adopted that specifically prohibits the shackling of pregnant inmates, while 6 states still absolutely have no ban on this barbaric practice. No pregnant inmate should be shackled without evidence that she is likely to harm herself, others, or her baby. Shackling a pregnant woman carries the risk of injury both to her and her unborn baby because it restricts maternal and fetal movement. There has been absolutely no documentation or attempts of where a pregnant inmate tries to, jump off her gurney while in labor. After childbirth, mothers are separated from their newborn babies, which strips them away from this crucial bonding period. This negative effect on the child's development, as well as the emotional state of the mother, is crucial. Research has also found that most correctional facilities fail to provide physician-recommended standards of care for pregnant women. And ignoring health standards and failing to provide needed care is not maintaining security, it's knowingly inflicting harm. Pregnant prisoners should have access to educational resources to promote their health and the health of their children. And in addition, prison staff must be educated about the unique nutritional needs of pregnant women. In 2017, the DOJ mandated that feminine hygiene products were to be given to inmates at no cost. Yet we see that many inmates continue to receive an inadequate number of supplies. For instance, Kimberly Haven. She received toxic shock syndrome from a homemade tampon during a 15-month sentence in Maryland, and she had to have an emergency hysterectomy to save her life. This should not be the case. In Colorado, it costs an incarcerated woman 2 weeks' wages to buy 1 box of tampons, and if there's a shortage, maybe more. Women should never have to choose between a feminine hygiene product or a call home to maintain family bonds. We give the necessary products to inmates such as clothes, bed sheets, mattresses, toilet paper. However, because women go through things that men don't, does that mean that feminine hygiene products aren't a necessity to their well-being? Feminine hygiene products are more than a monthly necessity. They demonstrate our society's commitment to self-worth and health. An astonishing 98% of incarcerated women have experienced some sort of physical, sexual, or abuse, or emotional abuse in their life. Situations that subject women to the power of correctional officers, including showers, using the restrooms, strip searches, can trigger traumatic memories for women who have survived this abuse. As a result, women inmates often live in a state of hyper-alertness, causing reactionary behavior that may be construed as aggressive from staff that result in cycles of repeated punishment, such as solitary confinement. The American Psychological Association found that 54% of state prisoners and 45% of federal prisoners have been diagnosed with some sort of mental health condition. Additionally, those with mental illnesses are 9 times more likely to be incarcerated than hospitalized, and 18 times more likely to find a bed in the criminal justice system rather than a hospital. To put it simply, we often view people behind bars differently, but each has a story and a life that they left behind, and how we treat our prisoners says a lot about who we are as a society. Let's be honest, we all have a part to play. So let's not forget about these women whose voices are harder to hear behind bars. So on behalf of the American Conservative Union, we strive to educate people on ways to reform the criminal justice system at both the state and federal levels. We support reforms based on conservative principles. We believe that every human being has inherent value, and thus we work to improve conditions of incarceration for all. So thank you so much for allowing me to be here and presenting this testimony for incarcerated women.
Thank you, Ms. Owens. Dr. Salisbury.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners, for inviting me to participate in this briefing. My name is Emily Salisbury, and I'm an Associate Professor of Criminal Justice from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I've been asked primarily to focus my testimony on the issues surrounding the inequity of custody classification and needs assessment of incarcerated women. I'll leave it to other panel experts to discuss in greater detail the many other critical issues that harm women in prison and that are in need of attention. It's been nearly 20 years since the National Institute of Corrections, which is a division of the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, discovered that the vast majority of state departments of corrections and the Federal Bureau of Prisons primarily use custody and needs classification assessments based on incarcerated men for determining incarcerated women's custody levels and programming needs. Unfortunately, the situation remains largely the same today, despite the gender-responsive solutions that emerged from my and my colleagues' research funded by the NIC, again, a division of the BOP. Of course, the question of whether women's custody and treatment needs in prison are exactly the same as men's is an empirical one, and I can tell you that the answer to this research question is a definitive no. Nearly 50 years, 50, of qualitative and quantitative research from scholars in the fields of criminology, law, social work, women's studies, medicine, public health, psychology, psychiatry, and sociology tell us that women are, sure enough, different and in need of different distinct needs. This has also been demonstrated from my scholarship. One of the major solutions of our NIC-funded research was the development and validation of a series of risk and needs assessments specifically designed by and for justice-involved women. The Women's Risk Need Assessment, also called the WRNA, allows prison staff to measure and case plan around the specific areas of risk and need that justice-involved women have. And the manner in which the assessment is conducted is intentionally designed to be delivered in a collaborative, gender-responsive, and trauma-informed way with women. 11 state correctional departments are currently using the WRNA in their female facilities, along with the countries of Singapore and the Czech Republic. I was part of the research team who created the WRNA, and I'm astonished that the BOP has yet to adopt this assessment system with its 29 women's facilities. After all, a division of the BOP funded the research. And while staff in the Women and Special Populations branch at BOP, who are sitting here today, have genuinely tried to do their best with the custody classification system that they have to use, any instrument that does not include the gender-responsive needs that statistically predict women's struggles will never be accurate and valid. It's what I call psychometric gymnastics. When correctional agencies assign different statistical weights and cut points and algorithms to try to fit the assessment system to women, whereas this wouldn't even need to happen if we started with women in mind in the first place, like we did when we created the WRNA. The costs of treating women like men are vast and exacerbated in confinement settings. A body of research shows that when we use offender risk and needs assessments designed with for men with women, they most typically end up overclassifying women. This means that they overpredict women's likelihood of engaging in misconducts in prison and recidivism in the community. This overprediction causes prisons to keep women in more severe prison conditions and to put more restrictions on them than is warranted by their behavior compared to men. To my knowledge, the BOP has never studied its classification tool for women to determine if this overclassification is occurring compared to men. And as far as determining women's programming needs, it's my understanding that the BOP custody tool does not even ask about these needs. Most importantly, our NIC-funded research found that several of the gendered needs actually function as risk factors for women's misconducts in prison. Women who suffered from child abuse, who showed symptoms of depression or anxiety, who were angry, who had symptoms of psychosis, who had histories of substance abuse, or who were engaged in unhealthy, dysfunctional, intimate relationships were more likely to incur serious misconduct violations within 1 year of incarceration compared to women who didn't display such characteristics. As a result, prisons should be doing more to focus on these needs that are specific to women's gendered experiences, because they are literally driving the problematic behavior that staff are concerned about within prisons and in the community upon release. And while the First Step Act is certainly progress, I'm afraid it will mistakenly perpetuate the problem because it is now codified into law that the BOP implement a risk assessment instrument, but not one that is gender responsive or gender specific or trauma informed, because it's not legally mandated to do so. Nevertheless, it should be kept in mind that the overwhelming majority of incarcerated women in this country are held in state prisons and local jails, not the BOP. Of course, this doesn't mean we should neglect the women housed by BOP, but we have to understand that this is largely an issue that needs to be addressed by states and local jurisdictions. Finally, despite the smaller numbers of women in prison, we must not forget that every single policy, practice, and procedure that we put in place that was designed for men and then applied to women affects every single woman 100% of the time, not 7%, not 8%, or whatever the incarceration rate of females is in any given correctional system. We harm women, their children, and their communities daily when we don't address their needs and empower their strengths. But it's not like there aren't solutions. We have the solutions, and that's perhaps the hardest part of this day and this briefing. The fact that we have evidence-based and gender-responsive and trauma-informed and culturally sensitive solutions, but the fact that we don't have enough enforcement and people who are courageous enough in positions of power to dare to care about this population. I'm grateful to have the honor of presenting this testimony today. I want you to know that I don't take it for granted, nor do I take it lightly, the privilege to be able to speak on behalf of women who haven't had the opportunity to speak for themselves on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salisbury. Ms. Mooney?
Thank you for inviting me to testify on such an important topic today. My name is Emily Mooney. I am a member of the Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties team at the R Street Institute. R Street is a nonprofit public policy research organization dedicated to promoting limited effective government. During my testimony, I will first provide a brief overview of recent trends as well as the unique needs presented by women in prison. I will then turn my attention to the harms associated with the familial disruption in maternal incarceration and conclude with a short agenda for change. The decision to incarcerate marks the zenith of government intervention, at which point we have entrusted our justice system with the power to revoke much of an individual's personal liberty, a sacred right in this country, in the name of public safety and accountability. Therefore, it is of the utmost importance that we as a society ensure that the aims of such interventions are being accomplished and that our fundamental values remain respected. To do so, we must ensure that when we incarcerate, we preserve human dignity, improve public safety, wisely allocate taxpayer dollars, and promote a stronger and freer society. Today, our nation is failing to achieve these fundamental aims. When facilities fail to provide adequate services and assess the unique needs presented by women in prison, the justice system is at risk of jeopardizing public safety, devaluing human dignity, and squandering taxpayer dollars. When we fail to account for the human toll of familial disruption, we miscalculate the societal cost of incarceration, the true cost, to the detriment of women, their families, and society at large. Over the last several decades, the number of women in prison has increased exponentially. In 1985, there were roughly 23,000 women in state and federal prisons. And by 2016, this number grew by over 380% to 110,000 women. In contrast, over the same time period, the number of males in state and federal jurisdiction grew by roughly 190%. As the number of women in prison has increased, so has the importance of assessing their unique pathways to crime and barriers to reentry. Indeed, research shows that women entering prison report higher rates of trauma, mental health issues, and substance abuse, and were, as a whole, more impoverished than males at the time they enter. Yet research also shows that federal and state facilities continue to fail to provide adequate services to meet these most basic needs. For many incarcerated women, these adversities are multifaceted and closely intertwined and must be addressed comprehensively. Rather than being treated with the dignity and care appropriate for their experiences of trauma, women are at high risk of further victimization while behind bars. Further, correctional staff and state facilities still often fail to receive the trauma-informed and gender-responsive training necessary to equip them to interact with a different population. Finally, the behavioral, mental, and physical health services needed to support imprisoned women are also lacking, as will be expanded upon by future panelists today. When we fail to acknowledge the traumatic experiences and struggles faced by imprisoned women, we miss an opportunity to promote healing and transformation and to give broken people and families a more stable foundation. Given their role as primary caretakers, the rising number of women in prison also inflicts harm upon families. Indeed, estimates provided by the Bureau of Justice Statistics suggest that 8 in 10 women who lived with their child prior to their incarceration provided most of their child's daily care. This means that children of incarcerated mothers are often separated from the person upon whom they depend most, whereas incarcerated fathers may rely on their child's mother to provide their child's care during their absence. Incarcerated mothers turn to extended family, grandparents, and sometimes the foster care system. The resulting familial disruption brings with it a host of negative externalities. Children practically present a new financial and emotional burden for caretakers, and research shows that children who have incarcerated mothers are at a higher risk for not forming healthy child attachments, a cornerstone in positive child development. Further, maternal incarceration can harm a child's health, bring shame and stigma, and promote antisocial behavior. When children of women in prison don't have parents that can care for them or relatives, they may find themselves in foster care. A national estimate suggests that 1 in 9 women in state prisons has a child in foster care, and in 2013 alone, approximately 20,000 children were placed in foster care, at least in part due to their parents' incarceration. Now, scholars show that in other cases, having a child placed in foster care may actually precede and accelerate a mother's downward spiral, ultimately leading to her incarceration. All mothers are not in similar circumstances. Regardless of the order of events, when a female prisoner's child is placed in foster care, familial reunification becomes all the more difficult. Social workers now have the arduous job of coordinating child contact and visits with a parent behind prison walls. And as the distance between an incarcerated parent and their child increases, so does the difficulty of securing visitation and communication. Even when a parent is placed in a facility nearby, other factors can practically undermine a positive child-parent relationship. Phone calls and other forms of communication are expensive. Children rely on caretakers to facilitate a relationship, and visitation policies that disallow physical contact may make visitation a negative or traumatic experience for children. As noted by Caitlin, the Adoption of Safe Families Act also puts parental rights at risk of being terminated. Thus, women with longer prison sentences or those who fail to reenter society successfully and are quickly reincarcerated are at greater risk of having their parental rights terminated. In some cases, this may not be in the child's best long-term interest, and in others it may be, but may simply put further strain on social service agencies. In all cases, the important role that female prisoners play as mothers makes ensuring their restoration and transformation behind bars, as well as their successful reentry into society, doubly important. Often their families are counting on them to reassume their duties as parents, and children are harmed when returning parents fail to live a more productive, healthy lifestyle. To conclude with a short agenda for change, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights should work to promote changes to state and federal policy that provide for the needs of women in prison and mitigate the harms associated with familial disruption. Jurisdiction should first assess the current needs of women in prison, as well as the services available to meet them. And both correctional officers and correctional administrations who craft policy should be properly equipped to interact and make policy for women. Barriers to familial connection should be minimized to the greatest extent possible, and social service and correctional agencies should collaborate to remove and identify barriers to familial reunification and promote successful reentry to ensure the needs of both mother and child are met. When formerly incarcerated women commit new crimes and return to prison, both public safety, child welfare, and society suffer. We pass on a legacy to yet another generation. It is time that we identify and correct current barriers in policy and provide women in prison a pathway toward true restoration. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Mooney. Ms. Nguyen?
Good morning. I sincerely appreciate your empathy into looking at the conditions of incarcerated women. My name is Pamela Nguyen. I am the founder of Restore Her, which is a nonprofit organization that advocates for incarcerated women. I'm also an RN, and I am also a formerly incarcerated woman. I served a 78-month federal sentence, and today I speak on behalf of the invisible women, and I call them the invisible women because we are the women that are not included in the criminal justice reform conversations. No one wants to talk about our needs. No one wants to talk about the harm that is done to us. During my 78-month sentence, I was pregnant during my incarceration. I was shackled. During the shackling, I fell. And when I fell, I was not taken to medical, nor ER or anywhere. And then for 2 weeks, my medical requests were ignored, and I was bleeding. I was told that it was normal after 2 weeks of finally sending a request. At that point, I explained to them that based on my medical knowledge and my education, that it was not normal. At that point, they told me that the only way that they could take me out to be seen is that they had to get send a request to the U.S. Marshals and get approval, which was a 4-week turnaround period. 4 weeks, so now we're talking about 7 weeks later, I go to the ER. It's no longer an emergency, and I'm turned away. We have to do another request, another 4-week turnaround period to get me to an obstetrician. At that point, I needed a ultrasound, which they did not have on premises at their facility. So there was another request and another 4-week turnaround period. During this time, I ended up miscarrying. And when I miscarried, I was locked in a cell with no emergency call button, no way to call anybody. It was dark, no lights. We got locked down at 10 o'clock at night. It wasn't about 2 o'clock in the morning before anyone came around and found me. At that point, it was a debate whether to call 911 or call the U.S. Marshals to take me to the ER. When I arrived at the ER, the Marshals met me there, and I was immediately shackled to the bed. Then, once I got an ultrasound to see what the status of my child was, I was told that I had passed my baby, and the guards were asked where was the linen and the things that I had bled on. And they said that they threw it in the trash. So my baby was thrown in the trash. After that, I was put in solitary, which they called medical observation. I spent a total of about 4 months in solitary. First, it was medical observation. Then I was transferred to another facility that had local inmates. So it was for my protection at that point, and that's where I remained until I was designated to a federal facility. The women that I bring to this room with me today, my story is one of many of theirs. And what's consistent with all our stories are shackling, solitary confinement, inadequate medical care, harmful, dehumanizing conditions, because during the time that I was miscarrying, I had 2 male officers between my legs the entire time that refused to leave the room and give me any kind of privacy or dignity, and family disruption. A common trend among not just federal and state, but also local, county, and private facilities is that there is no standardization of care. And the lack of standardization, and what it does is it provides and encourages your constitutional protection and your rights to be blatantly disrespected and violated. So today, for me, I would ask from this briefing, from this report, if you all would consider we should have a national ban on shackling. Yes, the First Step Act passed, which does ban shackling. However, what needs to be known is that, like said by one of the other panelists, federal and state contract with local and county facilities, and they are rampant with this type of behavior. They do their own things. They don't have standardizations of care, and they kind of call their own rules. And so although there is a federal law in place, it will not matter if you are in one of those places, which I was. I was in a private facility that contracted with the federal government. At the end of the day, I say the condition of women in prison is the responsibility of the American society. We have created this problem, and it was created by government entities, mandatory minimums, lawmakers, the war on drugs, and then it was perpetuated by the American society that continues to practice racism, classism, sexism, and these things which devalue women that are incarcerated. In order to improve these conditions, those are things that we must address, and we must speak up, and we must have a voice for these invisible women and do what we can to make a gender-specific environment for them that does not further perpetuate harm for them and their families. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nguyen. With that, I will open our panel for questions from my fellow commissioners. Commissioner Cladney, you want to start us off?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Nguyen, I'm sorry for your loss. And I was wondering if you could describe for me what 24 hours is like in solitary confinement.
Sure.
Can you put your microphone back on? Sorry.
I get this question often. People ask me, how did I maintain? My answer to that is I would start my day by thinking about my two sons, imagining what their day was like, what they may have been doing at that time, remembering fond memories of being with them. And then when I would exhaust those thoughts, I would think of plans when I returned home of things that I wanted to do. And when I would exhaust those thoughts, I would picture places I wanted to be and what I would want to be doing instead of being where I was. And once I exhausted those thoughts, I would just pray to have peace, pray to go to sleep, and pray for another day, which I didn't know when I would wake up if it was another day or not, because there are no windows, so you don't have any concept of day and night. So I would just pray that when I woke up, it was another day, and it would be a day closer to me being able to get out of there.
And do you have any human contact while you're in solitary?
No, sir. And the hour that you're let out, you have an hour, and in that time, you have to do your laundry, exchange your laundry. Some days you get a shower because you don't shower every day. So if you have a shower that day, you would need to shower. If you wanted to go outside, you could go outside, but you can only see up because everything around you is closed off by cement. And if you have time, try to call your family and speak to them.
Thank you. Ms. Salisbury, Dr. Salisbury, could you tell me on these classification tools, what is taken into account? Do they take like vocational needs, educational needs, things like that, or is it just conduct?
Thank you, Commissioner Cladney. I thought I did, sorry. Thank you, Commissioner Cladney. Yes, so it depends on whether we're talking about a custody classification instrument or a needs assessment instrument. So a custody classification instrument typically only includes what we call static or fixed factors that are typically focused on criminal history. So things like, what was the kind of crime like? What was the seriousness of the offense? Has this person ever been incarcerated before, and were they a problem in the institution before? How many misconducts did they incur? Upon reclassification, though, of custody, which should happen usually around every year, or whether there's a significant event that happens in the institution or with that individual, reclassification oftentimes will have a couple of variables, maybe one or two that are focused on whether or not the person had been involved in programming or vocational programming or treatment programming, to see if they can downgrade or if they need to upgrade the custody classification. But needs assessment instruments, which sometimes drive custody and sometimes they don't, it just depends on the jurisdiction and the State Department of Correction or BOP, will include those different needs that are more dynamic in nature and things that can be changeable and changed within treatment interventions.
Thank you. Dr. McLaren, you're with the Women in Special Population Branch, is that correct?
Yes.
You mentioned that BOP has made some progress. Could you tell us specifically what progress you think they've made?
Absolutely, and thank you. So the Bureau of Prisons has obviously been a correctional agency for quite a long time, and some kind of a position working on female issues has also existed for a long time. But it wasn't until 2014 that the Bureau made the decision to take female issues, as well as some other critically important reentry issues, and set them aside in a separate division to allocate appropriate resources. So they were removed under the Reentry Services Division umbrella. And that was when I came on board to become the administrator over the female issues and of the Women in Special Populations branch, and it became a real branch. So I would say that's the first step of progress. Additionally, it was just me when that branch started, and we've increased the staffing significantly. We quickly implemented a comprehensive policy, the Female Offender Manual, that prescribes what kind of programs we need to do that are gender responsive at all of our facilities, some different ways to manage women, addresses gender responsive discipline and why that's important. We implemented a large menu I referenced of programs that were specific to women. So in 2014, we did have a trauma treatment program. We expanded that across our female sites, and we've added more than 15 other programs, a dual diagnosis, women-specific residential drug abuse treatment program. In 2017, we issued guidance on expanding access to feminine hygiene products. So while they were always available at no cost to inmates, we had no standardization, and so therefore not necessarily variety. So since then, we've required at least 5 products at every female institution. And in December of last year, we issued additional guidance prohibiting rationing, explaining how those items need to be accessible so that people are not placed in an undignified position of having to ask for them, that they're available in common areas. And last, I think I'd like to talk about, which this was in my written statement, our Female Integrated Treatment Program, which is really a flagship program that we've put in at the low security female facility in Danbury. It's integrated, which means instead of having to address trauma or mental health needs or things in separate parallel order, they're all done together. Every single person in that facility is part of a treatment community, and the entire prison operates as a modified therapeutic community or a treatment facility versus a traditional prison model.
Thank you.
Commissioner Cladden,
You
I'm
said
going to
that-
call this as your last question. Let's get the
This
other
is it?
commissioner's question. If no one else has questions, you can come back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You said that your division was greatly increased in population. According to the OIG report, you have 4 people. And it also called for more people. And it also called for the executive staff to actually take the training that you've required of the entire staff at women's prisons. My question is has your division increased beyond 4 people? And has the executive staff taken the training?
Thank you. We currently have 4 staff in the Women in Special Populations branch. That's correct. We have 2 additional positions that are not filled at this time. So that would increase the total staffing to 6, counting me. But in 2014, it was just me. And with regard to the executive staff, most members of the executive staff have completed the trauma-informed care component of the training that we require for female facilities. And we had planned for me to personally give the remaining training to those who had not completed it. Some have, but that was at a meeting that was scheduled during the shutdown. So we will be rescheduling that for the future. So there are some that have not completed the remaining portion. Thank you.
Other questions? Commissioner Cladden,
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to all of you, the witnesses. Just a couple of numerical questions. I think, Ms. Mooney, you indicated that, and maybe I got this wrong, 23,000 inmates in 1985, and there's now 110,000. Is that correct?
So approximately 23,000 women. And so that's the Bureau of Justice Statistics counts prisoners with a greater than 1 year sentence or longer. So approximately.
And I'm assuming those are federal prisoners?
No, those are state and federal prisoners.
Okay, good.
Mhm.
I think also, and I just want to make sure I got the numbers correct here. I think Ms. Owens, you indicated that there were 28 female prisons and 83 male prisons, federal prisons. Is that correct?
28 federal women's prisons and 83 men.
Okay, do you have any data as to the relative population sizes in those prisons?
At the 28 federal women's prisons?
Yeah, both, male and
Both.
female. I just want to get a sense for what's the relative population size between female prisons and male prisons? Is it the same? Is it larger, smaller?
Right. So about 5% of women hold the state and federal statistics, and then 95 are men.
And I think it was Ms. Mooney again. There were 23,000 federal prisoners.
May I address the female prison
Sure.
population in the federal systems? I apologize. I don't know the procedure for jumping in. We have 29
Thanks for asking.
facilities for females. And some of those are two prisons that are co-located on the same site. So 29 locations, but for example, Carswell or Aliceville have two female prisons of different security levels or different missions located in the same site. Our female federal population is about 12,000 individuals. Some of the facilities are as large as about 1,000 people, and some of them, particularly the lower security, what we call a camp or a minimum, are smaller, and so may have just a few hundred individuals at that location.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I think this is also directed to Ms. Mooney, and this may not have anything to do with prisons necessarily, but just there was an incredible explosion, 23,000 to 110,000. Any data, any evidence as to what caused that explosion in the prison population?
So as some of the other panelists noted, changes in policy are one part of that, but I think there's, as well as how jurisdictions change and how they prosecuted women. So typically in the last couple of years, we've actually seen a decrease in male and female populations in typically urban areas. However, rural areas are continuing to see an increase in incarceration. And something I didn't mention, but I think is interesting, is we've also seen different trends in states when states have implemented criminal justice reform, that sometimes the male population starts to decrease, but the female population either stagnates or increases. So this kind of just, I think, shows that female needs are not being assessed even when we're implementing really great reforms that are thought to help the entire population. So those disparate trends are something that remain unaddressed.
Thank you.
Commissioner Arasaki?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I have a few questions. There was a lot of testimony about the need to try to keep women closer to their families so that they could visit. There's only 29 or however many. So obviously there's not even one per state, which would make it very difficult. So are there any plans, strategies, or is there plans to build more, to contract, to have alternative facilities in order to make it more possible for women to be closer to their families so that when they do get out, there'll be more positive outcomes?
I'll go ahead and go first, and then maybe if some of you want to speak to state or local issues, that would be helpful. I feel like I want to make sure I keep clarifying, like I can speak to the federal system and what we do in our practices, and some of those will be very similar across the board, and others of those may be specific to the Bureau of Prisons. So yeah, there's 29 facilities, and I don't think that we're here to suggest that we build more prisons, but that means that just by math, if you're spreading those across the country, there may not be a facility right near somebody's home. We require that our staff attempt to place individuals at facilities within 500 miles as a starting point. And we also require in our female offender manual, the policy that's specific to women, that the location of children and families is considered and discussed, so that that's a collaborative process if you're looking at trying to get someone closer to home over time. The last thing I'd want to point out is that part of our process towards reentry is the residential reentry center, or what you might think of as a halfway house. We call them RRCs. And those are the facilities that are community-based that somebody transitions into on their way out of the system, where they can continue to do programs. And we have more than 200 of those facilities. So it's much more likely that somebody would be placed in their local community or very close to their local community at that end part before they completely release from the system.
So basically, Dr. McLaren, if you're not building more facilities or finding alternatives, if you only have 29 and there are 50 states, then you will not be close. Most people will not be close to where they came from. It's just not physically possible. So it sounds like there just isn't any plan to address that problem. And it seems to me 500 miles, that's what, 8 hours at least away from, which if you don't have a car, which I would assume many women who, because they're coming in from impoverished circumstances, are not going to be able to get their kids there.
It's definitely a challenge. You're absolutely right. There's 50 states and 29 facilities. So
that's okay. So the legislation that was recent was called First Step. So I assume that means there are other steps. So
Many steps.
Yes. So what are the what other steps need to happen since we only have the first one? What if you rule the world? What are the next steps? What didn't happen that needs to happen?
Thank you for the question. Sorry, I'll be brief. I know we're running out of time. Again, as I wrote in my testimony and said today, I think it's really imperative to highlight the fact that, again, this risk assessment tool and system that's been mandated by the First Step Act is progress. However, again, it's not a gender-specific tool. So that means that we are going to continue to ignore the gender responsive and trauma-informed needs of justice-involved women and women prisoners in the federal system. And I think it's important also to mention that risk assessment and needs assessment are really important because they drive every subsequent decision on behalf of that prisoner throughout his or her term. And so that if the questions are not asked appropriately or not asked at all on the front end, then that means we are going to continue to not address them throughout the system on the back end and into the community.
Sure, Ms. Wynn.
To your first thing, I would say please not advocate for more prisons, but could we advocate for alternative sentencing? For me, I did not see my sons the entire 5 years I was incarcerated because of location. But again, no more prisons. Alternative sentencing, please. And if it was my perfect world, we would ban shackling and solitary nationwide. We would also provide a standardization of care and best practices nationwide. And we would hire adequate medical staffing, knowledgeable medical staffing, and do training, gender-specific and sensitized training for guards.
Great, thanks, Ms. Wynn. And I wanted to ask, because you had brought up the issue of you were in a private facility.
Yes, ma'am.
And in the written testimony, at least I read everything and I might have missed it, but there was not a whole lot of discussion about the role of private prisons. And so I hope that after, because we won't have time here, that afterwards you might consider, those of you who have thoughts about that. I'm concerned because since private prisons want to maximize profit, I think it makes them less likely to provide adequate health care, to provide adequate training, because their job is to maximize profit. So any post-briefing comments you have on that would be much appreciated.
The facility that I was at, like I said, they blatantly told me that they were not able to do anything for me. They told me that they didn't expect to have women there. They definitely did not expect to have a pregnant woman there. They say they didn't have even have a prenatal vitamin that they could give me. They had no contracts with any OB doctors. So when I was in solitary under medical observation, my question to them was, what are you observing? Because if you've already told me that you have nothing for me here, what is going to happen, when I have a situation, which I did end up having, and they weren't prepared. They didn't know what to do. And to this day, from my understanding, because I try to keep up with them, they still really don't have anything in place as of now.
Thank you.
Ms. Owens, I just wanted to give you a chance to look like you were going to answer the First Step Act questions.
Yeah, I was hoping to answer both questions, actually. For the first one, I agree with everyone. I would hope we don't build more prisons. I hope we close prisons, to be honest. But 60% of men, or excuse me, 60% of women are in prison because of substance abuse. That's a lot. And as I said before, more people are likely to find a prison bed open than a hospital. And for substance abuse women and men, it should not be a prison that they go to. It should be a treatment facility. And so to your first question, I think that instead of, housing more inmates in prison and putting them behind bars, I think that we need to have treatment programs and things like that to help them. And again, like I said, 95% of inmates are going to be released. So it just reflects back on us on how are we going to treat, the people behind bars with human dignity. And to the second question with the First Step Back, I would like to see a nationwide ban as well, federal, state, and local levels, not shackling pregnant inmates, but also just educating every correctional officer, whether it's a female or a male, on when women have substance abuse issues, they more than likely have been abused traumatically, physically, sexually. And so, like I've said in my written statement, a lot of post-traumatic stress comes about that. So training the correctional officers to deal with those needs are really important. And I would love to see that in the second or third step.
Thank you. Madam Vice Chair.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, the panelists, for appearing. Dr. McLaren, you started off talking about that women and men are different, and you went on to say that the differences are magnified by prison, and that came through loud and clear in much of the testimony that we've received, written testimony from others. I was wondering if you could talk to us about the average age of the women in federal prisons and in state prisons. And where I'm going with this is that we've heard that 60% of the women in prison have substance abuse issues. So I then want you to talk to me about whether there's any kind of, what the standard is for providing gynecological exams. And did we get all of that?
Okay, I think so. All right. Thank you. And remind me if I veer off in the wrong direction. Okay, starting with average age. I actually brought some data with me so that I could be really precise. And again, I can speak to federal prisons, although this is a place that I don't think we differ vastly with the state system. There are some places, like in terms of type of offense, that there might be differences. But our largest age group is going to be women ages 26 to 45, and that's going to be over 60% of our population. So you may have seen that we are seeing in corrections as a whole this sort of graying of corrections, that we are seeing more older individuals coming into prison, as well as, because of longer sentences, people doing time until they are much older. But our female population that is over 65 is only about 2%. So very small.
So that 26 to 45 is basically, within prime childbearing years. And so I want you to talk about what the standard is in terms of providing gynecological examinations for women.
And before you answer that, I just want to say to you that if we don't ask you the magic words to get the rest of the data that you brought today, we still would like you to submit it. So.
Yes. Absolutely. Anything you need, the policies that I've referenced, I'll follow up.
Thank you.
Okay, so gynecological care. And to the point of providing materials, what I can do is submit to you our patient care statement. So you don't just have my little blip here, but you have in detail exactly what is required by policy. Facilities that house women have a different staffing complement, if you will, in both medical and in psychology departments, so that you would have a higher ratio, because there are obviously unique medical needs, and I know you're going to hear about those later on today, but women's reproductive system requires significant attention and intervention, especially during childcare ages. When people enter into the system, everyone is administered a pregnancy test so that we know if an individual comes into the system with child, we are able to immediately identify them, assign a code in our data system so that we are made aware, so that there are certain things that would go into place in terms of how we manage that individual if they have special like they need to be in a lower bunk, or they need to be closer to food, or they need to have extra nutritional meals, that everyone would become aware. And then they do get gynecological exams. We try to have a gynecologist or a women's health specialist on staff at our facilities, but medical staffing can be a challenge. Hiring physicians that want to work in prison is not always an incredibly easy task. So there are places that is contracted out.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Yaki.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank all of you for your comments today. Quick follow-up to Commissioner Narasaki. I also would like people in the future panels to address the qualitative or otherwise condition of care between that received inside of a federal or state-run institution versus a privately run institution to see. We'd like to get some color on that. This goes to Dr. McLaren. Doctor, I chair on the commission a subcommittee that is dealing with the family separation and child detention issues at the southern border. And although I'm not going to ask you to go into quite a lot of detail about that, because that's probably a very small subset, it does bring up, I think, a large issue for minority populations, especially newcomers, and no one's more of a newcomer than someone who's just been picked up and taken from their kids at the border. What does the Bureau of Prisons do with regard to ensuring cultural and language access for these folks, some of whom speak dialects from their native villages that are very difficult even for normal translators to do? How do they explain to them what the circumstances are? And in a follow-up to us, I don't expect you to do this here, I'd be interested to see what the Bureau of Prisons has done with regard to ensuring that they have information about any children that they may have been separated from. But generally, overall, how are cultural and language access issues, and this can also go toward anyone who may have come in from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, wherever, how are those issues dealt with in the BOP system for women, especially when it comes to the fact that they may be separated from their children for whatever reason?
Thank you for the question. And again, when there's many parts, I'm afraid I'm going to miss one. So please push me back if I'm not hitting all of the pieces of it. About 1,300, give or take, of the female population that I referenced are going to be non-U.S. citizens at any given time. So those are going to be primarily the individuals that I think we're referencing here that may not speak the English language, although there could be some overlap there. We have translation services available where somebody, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but they're able to use a phone line and call so that they can, speaking Spanish is very easy at our facilities. We pretty much always have people that are able to speak fluently in Spanish, but other languages that may be less common where we don't have a staff member or an individual on site that can translate, we have a phone service that can assist with that. We also
Do you know how many languages are supported by that phone service?
I don't, but I can find out for
Thank
you. We've translated several of our programs for women into Spanish. So it is kind of our starting point, and the majority of people that don't speak English speak Spanish in our system. So we have translated and deliver quite a few of those programs. Our big residential drug abuse program that has a gender-specific piece to it, or a gender-specific program that is different than the male program, also has a Spanish language program that women can choose to go to, even if they are more comfortable in Spanish, but also speak English. And then you also asked about how we get information about one's children. We would primarily use, before they arrive, the pre-sentence investigation report, which is prepared for us by the Administrative Office of the U.S. Court System, the probation officers, which involves a great depth of interview with multiple people, not just the individual coming to prison, and generally would lay that out. But then once somebody arrives at the facility, there's an intake and then additional more intensive, we call them team meetings, where the different departments that are involved in an individual's care.
Now, when you talk about the pre-sentence report, you're talking about people who have been through the full range of the court system. right?
Yes.
Are there other people who were transferred to Bureau of Prison facilities who have not been through that, i.e. detainees at the border? So they don't have that kind of report. So how do you get information on them that would be relevant to their station at that facility?
Okay. It could happen that somebody came in pretrial status and we did have very limited data on that individual, that the marshals or one of our other law enforcement partners brought them to us in a pretrial capacity where that documentation simply didn't exist. And at that point, we would need to ask the individual. And we do. I mean, that is part of our process, is to gather as much information as possible during an intake screening.
I don't want to take up too much of the commission time, but what I do want to ask you to follow up with is it more than just a phone service? Are there people detailed at any of these institutions, particularly along the southern border, who have an understanding not just of the language, but of the culture there? Because for someone who has never been in a prison before, who was just picked up at the border, how they're treated, how the whole prison system has a way of dealing with people at odds with the culture of how people are treated, touched, spoken to in a different language, in a different village. They may come from, a small village in the middle of Colombia. So I just want to know if you can get back to me with information about that. That would be very helpful.
I can. I think some of those facilities that you're referencing may be ICE operated and not Bureau of Prisons facilities. So they may be outside.
I'm talking about there's a whole new set of BOP facilities that have been put up near the southern border where a lot of these folks are being transferred to. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but then illuminate me, because I'm just reading what I read in the papers from your own releases, that 1,600 detainees were sent to BOP facilities. So if you can just get back to me, that'd be great.
Commissioner Degwele?
I'd like to add my thanks to all the panelists for the important and thoughtful testimony. Ms. McLaren, could you speak to the issue that Professor Salisbury mentioned about the WARNA, which, as the professor explained, was conducted, a BOP commissioned a study of its impact, and I'm wondering, what is your view of the results of that study?
Thank you. The National Institute of Corrections is, in fact, a division of the Bureau of Prisons that is involved in training, and some of them are here in the room today. But the Bureau of Prisons uses a custody classification system that's been validated on our population using data specific to our population. And men and women were evaluated and validated separately. There are different cutting scores and values applied so that the tool is predictive for women that are in Bureau of Prisons custody. We then take, that's primarily to the risk portion, although there are need pieces like substance use that are woven into that tool. And then we do individualized assessments that I referenced earlier with individuals from there. So that is our current process. But I believe people have mentioned that under the First Step Act, we're working expeditiously to implement the provisions of that as required. And there will be a review conducted of various other risk and need assessment tools. Then it will be determined what's appropriate for the Bureau of Prisons.
Two follow-ups. First, apologies, it's Dr. McLaren. Dr. McLaren, was your response to me about the assessments of the existing tools that BOP uses, or about the tools that I understand have not been adopted? I was unclear about your response.
I was talking to you about the Bureau of Prisons' current procedures. We do not currently use the Women's Risk Need Assessment tool.
So are you familiar with the results of the study that was referenced or not?
Yes.
What were the results of that study?
That the tool is valid and useful with female populations.
Has the Bureau of Prisons previously analyzed its own tools? Something else that Professor Salisbury said is that she was unaware of BOP analyzing its own classification tool.
The Bureau has most certainly analyzed its own classification tool.
So Professor Salisbury was just mistaken on that one?
I don't want to speak for her. I'm going to let her speak.
I can speak to that,
Please.
yeah. So I'm not aware of anything that's been published in terms of the custody classification tool that's used with female prisoners by the BOP. But what I would add is that there are certain, even the statistical analyses need to be gender responsive.
Fair enough.
So whether or not that has happened, I'm unaware of.
Okay, so I may be missing something, but it seems to me that the net result of the testimony that we've heard is that the WRNA is out there. There are some positive indications about how it may contribute to women in custody, and yet the BOP, for some reason that's not entirely clear to me, seems to be hesitant to embrace that evidence-based approach. And so I'm wondering if you could just explain to those of us in the room and watching on the internet why it is that there are indications about a positive path that our United States Government Bureau of Prisons is resistant to.
As I said, we have significant data to support our current approach. I am familiar with this tool. We continually evaluate our process, and I am happy to take this suggestion back to the agency.
Fair enough. We all can decide what we can decide, and I understand that other people have views, but I think that's at the core of one of the issues that we've heard about today. Thanks for your responses. Professor Salisbury and Ms. Mooney, Dr. McLaren laid out a bunch of items, policies, things that are in place that are sort of a greatest hits of innovation or leading efforts that BOP is engaged in. In my experience, there are challenges that exist as gaps between articulated policies and how policies are implemented on the ground. For example, I would imagine that if I were to ask Dr. McLaren whether the experience of Miss Wynn is consistent with policies, it's my great hope that some of what happened to Miss Wynn and the very difficult circumstances in which she was forced to exist, possibly at the risk of her own life as well as that of her child, are probably not consistent with policies. Perhaps Dr. McLaren can help me understand if I have that wrong. But I want to hear from you. What are the core issues about where the practices are not meeting the policies, or is it primarily that the policies are just not right?
So I've read the female offender manual. That is unique. States often do not have that, or it's not well implemented. So I think the Federal Bureau of Prisons has done a good job in making progress. But to speak primarily to the states, a problem that we're saying is that they'll have a policy where women are supposed to be housed in the prison closest to their children. But then you have prison overcrowding, or you have contracting out to local jails, in which we know often don't provide the same long-term services that women need. So to speak to the state thing, I don't think it's that administrations don't want to do the right thing. I think that often they don't have the funding to do it. We're saying in Wyoming just this week, there's a lawsuit that a couple of women in prison launched because of unsafe conditions of confinement. You see calls for overcrowding leading to shouts for new prisons in Oklahoma and other states. So I think that the salience of this issue is still not something that governors, that members of state legislatures, or even Congress are paying attention to really put the adequate funding behind the rehabilitation part and services and alternatives to make sure that the women that don't need to be in the prison system aren't in the first place. I think that's one of the core problems in raising the salience of this issue. And as we know, also, making sure that correctional administration are also making sure that their staff are implementing policies is important as well. There was a report, a gender practice risk assessment, or I'm getting the title wrong, of Logan Correctional Facility in Illinois that was really interesting to read, where they noticed that although they were trying to form gender responsive training, correctional staff still held attitudes that were very hostile towards women, called them derogatory names, didn't buy into the idea of a type of training that responded to unique female needs. So this is still an issue that needs to be translated into practice. But I think that's a cultural and a salience issue as well as a funding issue.
And to add to that is a combination of lack of policies, and where there are policies, a lack of implementation by the staff.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd also add that 90%, some research actually shows, outside of even criminology, but that 90% of new initiatives fail not because they're not good initiatives or good ideas, but because people don't put, or systems don't put, an implementation plan in place. So part of the issues and things that I'm literally geeking out on lately is this science of implementation and understanding that we oftentimes in corrections and in lots of different fields focus on the competency drivers of implementation, which means focusing on training and selecting the right staff and hiring the right staff. We oftentimes call that in my world, we train and pray. We hope that the staff actually take on the things that are discussed in training. But what we don't focus on a lot is the leadership drivers and the other drivers that focus on understanding what it takes to really drive change. And this is something, an initiative, it's actually more than initiative. I oftentimes don't like to call it an initiative because then when people say, all right, the initiative's over, to sustain and implement cultural change that we're talking about today is going to take a tremendous amount of funding. It's going to take a tremendous amount of education of staff and of leadership to understand all the myths that when we say the words gender responsive and trauma informed, this doesn't necessarily mean coddling women. It does mean that we can hold women accountable and still provide healing inside institutions and outside institutions. It also means that we have to just continue to discuss this issue and, tie it to performance evaluations of staff. Are they actually adhering to what we call gender responsive and trauma informed care inside prisons? But I can tell you that, many of us in this room have seen what the solutions look like inside institutions. They can happen, but it's going to take a significant amount of effort for the implementation drivers to really be focused upon and move forward.
What is, in your perspective, what is the greatest, what are the greatest arguments against embracing the WRNA? There seems to be this gap. And so I want to understand that the people that are resisting taking this evidence-based approach, they're probably resisting it for a reason. Is it cost? Is it a philosophical
I think it's, I think it's cost, but I think it's also that many folks feel like in positions of power about this issue will say that their custody classification tool works good enough. And good is the enemy of great, right? And if we want to really address and embrace what we know to be state of the art with justice involved women in terms of the evidence-based and correctional sort of evidence, we have to make sure that we use, of course, the most state-of-the-art risk assessment tools. So part of it is cost. I think part of it is mythology about what we're talking about. And I think a lot of it is just not having that appropriate ethic of care of starting with women in mind.
Madam Chair, can I sneak in one more quickly?
This is your last one.
Okay. A very thoughtful panel. Ms. Owens, to what extent is the evolving science of trauma impacting how we treat our prisoners, our female prisoners? It seems to me that the science is growing in that area, the understanding of the going forward effects of trauma, and how central is this in BOP's approach and perhaps in the state approaches?
I would say it's very important. I mean, what we're doing now, having this conversation, but also having conversations with leadership and hearing from formerly incarcerated women, such as Pam and others, the education behind it forces the narrative and forces communication and forces policy change, legislative change, and then implementing it. A lot of people that I talk to don't believe, members of the state and federal level, don't believe that certain things happen behind bars. And a lot of the things that I talk about, they think are already in place. So again, just educating them on, 60% of women, have substance abuse problems. About 80% to 90% of women have already been sexually assaulted before even entering the prison system. And so when we think about that, and then address that to members and also just advocates, then that's when we get the policy changes put in place. And we see it across the states right now. ACU is in 8 target states this year. And last year, we have seen tremendous growth with addressing the trauma-related needs of women.
To speak to the science, if I could butt in for a second, there's been really some good research coming out of UCLA that talks to about how women respond psychologically different, and have created this term of like the tend and befriend approach, in which in instances of trauma, we're very familiar with flight or fight, that actually women tend to nurture and to care for their young ones and to befriend and use that social component to relieve that stress and that PTSD. So I think that's really important to underscore why instances such as Pam's, when she's placed in solitary confinement after a loss of her child, how that is so antithetical to the rehabilitative notion of giving someone a social outlet. And I think this also ties into how instances and responses to disciplinary infractions, if a woman's talking too loudly, something like that, that might actually be just a response to their instance of trauma and how they're trying to seek comfort in coping. So I think that's really important. There's some really good psychology, biology literature that's coming out of UCLA in particular that deals with kind of how psychologically women and men differ.
Thank you.
So I know Commissioner Gladney has a set of questions he's chomping to ask, but I have a few of my own, so I'm going to try to go quickly through them and still save time for him. Dr. McLaren, I really appreciated your testimony about recent changes to BOP manuals that sound quite welcome. There is one that I don't welcome, and so I wanted to hear from you about what's happening, and that is a recent change to the Transgender Offender Manual, which instructs the BOP to make housing decisions based on the biological sex the initial determination, rather than what the previous manual had said, which is that housing should be in accordance with gender identity. So I wonder if you can speak to the rationale for making that change and how it is being implemented. And I would like to say that I hope you'll speak to us against a backdrop of an enormously distressing article that the vice chair shared with me yesterday from North Carolina, which I realize is not one of your prisons, but a transgender woman who is housed in a men's prison and is talking about the fear and the danger that she experiences every day. And that is, I imagine, not distinct from what transgender women would experience in the BOP as well.
Thank you for the opportunity to talk about this important issue. Our transgender population in the Bureau of Prisons is large. The way we define transgender, just so that we're adhering to that nuance, is that an individual gets to self-identify. So that's who I'm speaking to, and we have over 700 individuals that identify as transgender. The vast majority of those individuals, about 80%, are individuals who were assigned the male sex at birth. Well, the change in the Transgender Offender Manual is quite small, and it was simply made to clarify the importance of safety and a variety of factors in looking at designations. In terms of what we consider, though, we still consider an individual's wish as to where they wish to be housed, the safety of that individual, the safety of other individuals. And so the sex assigned at birth is simply a starting point. We usually have a great deal more data beyond that. That's just a starting point. We have internally, our process is a transgender executive council that I sit on along with general counsel, health services, psychiatry, psychology, and our correctional services people. Every single decision we make is made through the lens of safety. That is our priority, and safety of that individual and safety of everybody else.
That's enormously comforting. Can you explain what the genesis of the change in the manual was, given that you make these careful and detailed determinations that are not necessarily in accord with that initial determination?
It was simply a clarification.
It's not really a clarification to change 100% of the policy.
The 100% of the policy didn't change. And in practice,
it's 100% change in that element. So it used to be that housing was in accordance with the gender identity, and now it is that the initial housing decisions are made based on biological sex as the initial determination.
when I say clarification, I think what I'm trying to get at is that was always the starting point. That was always the first place that we looked, unless someone had completed surgery, in which case they had a new gender and were no longer transgender, they were post-surgical. That was always the starting point. And so it just made that a little bit more clear that in the absence of other information, this would be the starting place for an individual, but that would always be the case. And then when we have additional information about somebody's transition, about their compliance with hormones or whether they're taking them, about their mental health functioning and programming, and what their interest area is in terms of some people prefer to stay at a particular facility and we wouldn't want to make a move that they didn't support.
Thank you. Dr. Salisbury, you included in your written testimony very compelling information about the effects of a Department of Justice investigation into an Alabama prison and what followed from that. And I wonder if you have other information about the benefits or the effects of Department of Justice investigation and also currently pending investigations from the department.
Thank you. Yes, I think that DOJ investigation has been incredibly important at actually setting precedents for understanding that we need to have gender responsive and trauma-informed care and policy and people who obviously understand the issue. I know you're going to be hearing testimony later this afternoon and throughout the rest of the day about specifically what's going on in Alabama, and so I'll reserve my sort of comments to sort of what I know. I wasn't heavily involved in that DOJ investigation, so I can't really speak to it, but I will say that the fact that investigation happened and that Alabama, as I understand it, is complying with nearly every part of the provisions of that consent decree is incredibly important for other states and for the BOP to really take a hard look at, because obviously it's pending litigation if other states don't address it.
Thank you. And Ms. Mooney, in this age of social media, I saw on Twitter yesterday that you tweeted about a state statute or a bill passed out of a state legislature that would require.
So it was just out of a House that hadn't passed in the Senate yet, to clarify.
So you know your tweet. Thank you. But it was about the requirement to consider best interest of a child before parental rights are terminated because a parent is incarcerated. And I wonder if you could speak to the value of that recommendation. I take it you liked it because you tweeted it, and what you think would be beneficial as a change in policy on that.
So some states have included provisions that disallow the termination of parental rights specifically for a parent's incarceration. However, it really varies incredibly by state to state. In other states, there might be certain communication or contact policies that a parent needs to meet. But frankly, correctional agencies, social service agencies don't often do a great job about communicating. So a social worker might not even know in what prison a parent's located. A prisoner might feel ashamed of having a child in foster care, might not let the correctional system know. So some states have done a good job of starting to integrate that data sharing and that communication, but many have not. I guess the ideal policy change would be including that specifically in statute, that parental incarceration alone is not adequate means to terminate parental rights. However, I'm sure some child welfare professionals might push back a little bit because if a parent is practically incarcerated for 10 years, it is hard for me, at least, to say that I would know what the best interests of the child are in that case. But it's to just really ensure that at the least, at the minimum, unless that child is in danger of harm, that parental and child relationship is being supported, which we're seeing right now, that's not always the case.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I said that was my last question, but I lied. I have a new question, just got handed to me, which is, Dr. McLaren, could you speak to what the Bureau of Prisons is doing to ensure that state prisons follow the PREA, especially regarding anti-shackling and feminine hygiene products guidelines?
The Bureau of Prisons does not have oversight or enforcement of state facilities, so we can't do anything to ensure. That would be other parts of the Department of Justice that would be involved in the oversight of PREA. We can only make sure that we are following PREA in the federal facilities, and we are. I used to be the national PREA coordinator and was there when we developed the policy shortly after the standards were issued in 2012. We worked very closely with our partners in the Department of Justice, as well as many of the external groups, advocacy groups, and just experts, the PREA Resource Center, and we remain involved in answering detailed questions that have considerable nuance. That information then goes out to the states for guidance. I hope that captures that.
It does. Thank you. So you have 2 minutes, Commissioner Cladney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll ask my 15 questions as quickly as possible. Ms. Mooney, just quickly, I know in my state, when there's termination cases, the woman is assigned a lawyer and is also transported to court for a hearing. Is that the way it is in every state?
I will not say that I know in every state whether or not that's the case. I think that's the intention of many state statutes. Whether or not that's always able to happen or there's proper notification and the follow through is there, I'm unsure.
I just see a panelist shaking a head behind you, so perhaps we'll hear more about that in a later panel. But let the record reflect that there's head shaking as if it's no.
Okay, thank you. Dr. McLaren, I was wondering, the BOP does not use BFOQs, do they?
We do not know.
Does anybody on the panel have an opinion as to whether they should be used in certain positions within institutions?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I served as an expert witness and provided expert testimony, written testimony to a case in Washington State with the Washington State Department of Corrections. They, I want to say, had BFOQs for about 100 positions, I want to say, 90 to 100 positions in women's prisons that were basically the private areas, the showering areas inside the prisons, and the union sued the Washington DOC for having those BFOQs. I will say that the judge actually gave summary judgment with that sided with the Washington Department of Corrections for having those BFOQs. And so again, there is a legal precedent there that has been set to have those BFOQs in place.
So you would say they are a positive in women's institutions?
Absolutely, given the amount of sexual assault and that women have experienced, and where typically these things happen in terms of sexual assaults that happen inside prisons. Yes, I would fully support that.
Dr. McLaren, could you explain your division's role in selecting wardens for female facilities?
Thank you for the question. My branch has 4 primary responsibilities: engagement with stakeholders, many of whom have been consultants.
I'm actually running out of time.
Oh, I'll talk fast. Training, policy, and programs.
Well,
we
good.
are not involved in staff selection. So those selections are made by the executive staff, which is the senior governing body of the agency. And that's
Is there any special
wardens.
training required for those positions as being a warden?
Anyone that works at a female institution has to complete the same basic training that we referenced earlier, all of the corrections training, and then a special module on trauma-informed care and on working with females in prison.
Does the executive staff have knowledge and experience with female offenders outside of your division?
The executive staff is made up of about 15 individuals that all represent different divisions with a wealth of correctional knowledge. So I would be hesitant to go into their backgrounds, but I can certainly get you their backgrounds.
Okay, I appreciate that. And finally, for the panel, do you think it would be helpful for the commission if we could visit a female institution and actually go to lunch and go to see the being in solitary confinement for about 15 minutes?
I would recommend visiting a state and federal institutions, maybe as well as a jail.
I agree, but there's one problem with that. When third parties come in to visit, they make sure anybody that's going to speak up or say what's really going on is not able to even get close to the people that come in.
I'd also say that you do more than a tour, right? And that you actually spend time speaking with women who are incarcerated and deciding for yourselves who you're going to speak to. and not allow leadership inside an institution to dictate who you talk to.
I would second that suggestion. And we have and do allow people to come inside of federal facilities and talk to the women that they wish to talk to. So we'd be happy to host that.
So we could just hang out there?
In a
Okay, and
matter
with
of
that-
speaking.
Well,
Thank
because
you.
I understand you only have 7 maximum security women and the rest are low and minimum. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And with that, this panel is going to conclude. I thank each of the panelists for your testimony, and we will come back at 10:50 to begin on panel 2. Thanks very much.
Oh, I just threw a pen across the room. Oh, well.
I was reversing the fact that I'm here so late, but on the other hand.
I thought of something for one of you guys today.
So
Okay, we're coming back to order now, as it's 10:51. We're going to proceed with our second panel, which is titled An Analysis of Women's Health, Personal Dignity, Sexual Abuse in the U.S. Prison System. Again, given some of the topics that come up with regard to women in prison, I remind our panelists and the public and my fellow commissioners that since 1983, Congress has prohibited the commission from taking in or serving as a clearinghouse for information about abortion, so please tailor your remarks accordingly. My mic is on, and I'll lean in toward it. Thank you. In the order in which they will speak, our panelists are Julie Abate, National Advocacy Director, Just Detention International; Andy Moss, founder of the Moss Group; Dr. Jamie Meyer, Assistant Professor of Medicine and Assistant Clinical Professor of Nursing, Yale University School of Medicine; Dr. Carolyn Sufrin, Assistant Professor of Gynecology and Obstetrics, Johns Hopkins School of Medicine; Betsy Ginsburg, Clinical Associate Professor of Law and Director of the Civil Rights Clinic at Cardozo School of Law; and Brenda V. Smith, Professor of Law, Senior Associate Dean, American University Washington College of Law, and former Commissioner, National Prison Rape Commission, Director, Project on Addressing Prison Rape. Ms. Abate, please begin.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you all today, and especially to address the topic of sexual abuse of women prisoners. I recently started my position as the National Advocacy Director for Just Detention International, which is a health and human rights organization whose sole mission is ending sexual abuse in all forms of detention. But my experience with custodial sexual abuse of women prisoners started in 1993. When I co-counseled a class action suit with Brenda Smith at the end of the table, women prisoners versus the Department of Corrections for DC here in the district. And that case established that the women prisoners here in DC had their Eighth Amendment rights violated by staff rape and staff sexual harassment that rose to the level of a constitutional violation. More recently, until May of last year, I was the deputy chief in the Special Litigation Section, Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. It was there that I focused on the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act enforcement. I was ultimately led the Corrections Practice Group, which was focused on implementing the CRIPA Act. Also at DOJ, I was a member of the Attorney General's PREA working group, which ultimately wrote and drafted the final PREA standards on detecting, preventing, and addressing prison rape in our jails and prisons. And as I discussed further in my written testimony, each of those methods of combating sexual abuse can be effective, yet each is really significantly limited. Private Eighth Amendment litigation is primarily limited by the Prison Litigation Reform Act's barriers to access to courts and by the issue of consent, and I put that word in air quotes and in actual quotes whenever I write it. And because it's apparently difficult to believe one single woman's experience of being sexually abused in prison, single plaintiff cases, as opposed to class action cases, appear to have even more difficulty overcoming this issue of consent. Both types of litigation, single plaintiff and class action, often take years to even get to a findings of liability and longer still to implement remedies. CRIPA investigations have to overcome that same consent hurdle even before they get out of the Department of Justice. And I should note that in all my dealings with jurisdictions in CRIPA cases of sexual abuse, not one jurisdiction or agency has actually raised the defense of consent in negotiating those settlements. Also, DOJ brings far too few CRIPA investigations to have a meaningful impact on women prisoners' sexual safety. They bring far too few CRIPA investigations of any conditions of confinement in any jails or prisons in general. Between fiscal years 2010 and 2018, the Special Litigation Section opened an average of just 2 CRIPA investigations into jails and prisons per year. PREA has great potential, but it's also super problematic because there's no real enforcement mechanism. States face the potential loss of 5% of certain federal funds for not implementing the PREA standards. And the PREA audit system has been flawed. There are steps to correct it, but it has been flawed. Audits were supposed to provide reliable information about a facility's PREA implementation, but it has not. DOJ has strengthened the auditing system in 2017, but inaccurate and unreliable audits still exist. And the real danger is that poor audits can provide a false sense of security, and people, including advocates, tend to take those audits at face value. Even when facilities legitimately receive passing audits, they can still have problems with prisoner sexual safety and even problems that violate prisoners' constitutional rights. And like I said, PREA does offer hope for women prisoners' sexual safety as a starting point. But women's prisons that implement PREA without also instituting the gender-responsive and trauma-informed programs and practices we've been hearing about will not adequately address women prisoners' sexual safety. Culture change is crucial, and the preamble to PREA recognizes this. It states, the success of the PREA standards in combating sexual abuse in confinement facilities will depend on effective agency and facility leadership and the development of an agency culture that prioritizes efforts to combat sexual abuse. Effective leadership and culture cannot, of course, be directly mandated by rule, yet implementation of these standards will help foster a change in culture by institutionalizing policies and practices that bring these concerns to the fore. And in women's prisons, that must be done through a gender-responsive lens. So what works in women's prisons? What works is to change the culture in women's prisons, to change the way that staff interact with women prisoners, to institute the evidence-based, gender-responsive, trauma-informed practices that most, if not all, of today's panelists will discuss directly or indirectly. Because even when litigation or CRIPA investigations, even when they work and establish liability for constitutional violations, that's when the real work begins, the real work of implementing sustainable culture change. In my experience, establishing the pattern of practice violation was never the hard part. The hard part was figuring out the solution. The starting point should be to identify the systemic weaknesses that facilitated abuse and the cultural problems at each facility that allowed the abuse. In each of the 8 investigations spanning 8 states where I've worked on different sexual abuse cases for women prisoners, and one for transgender women housed in men's prisons statewide in the state of Georgia, the biggest risk population to be in is a transgender woman in a men's facility that does not recognize their proven vulnerabilities. At any rate, the cultural differences have ranged from the stereotypically harsh and punitive abusive culture to a culture of apathy to an overly familiar and even friendly-seeming culture that allowed at least 2 serial sexual predators to openly groom their victims without raising any red flags and allowed one of them to rape and sexually abuse numerous women for years. So those types of cultures don't develop overnight, and they're not going to be fixed overnight. Creating remedies has to include taking the time to work with the jurisdiction to develop solutions that will work for that facility, its staff, and its prisoners, and identify the specific issues that need to be remedied. Can't be done exclusively by attorneys, but you must include practitioners who know what can be done and what will be done. And agreements need to be drafted to ensure success. Jurisdictions deserve credit for their progress to feel like their efforts are being recognized. The biggest challenge to successful culture change is sustainability. Change cannot be driven solely by a few individuals. Effective change requires support from the very top, including commissioner level, governor level. Few people in those top positions understand what women prisoners need. The most important safeguard is to have upper-level permanent positions created to oversee women's prisoners whose decisions and policies are implemented without being second-guessed or overruled by people who do not understand how to safely run women's prisons or how to support women's prisoners.
Thank you, Ms. Abate. Ms. Moss?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and to
Neither's mine.
Okay, I just thanked you. Okay.
We definitely want to hear that.
Yes, okay. My name is Andy Moss, and my position today is informed by over 3 decades of working as a correctional practitioner and consultant. My early work in Georgia, living on prison grounds in a massive reform effort, doing a large lawsuit addressing staff sexual misconduct and general conditions, really projected the arc of my career. I went from that experience to the National Institute of Corrections, where I chaired the Women's Initiative for the Institute. During that period of time, we conceptualized and built the gender responsive principles that NIC has distributed throughout the country. After 20 years in state and federal government, I saw a real need to support the field with these similar efforts. And so I started the Moss Group with a mission to build cultures of safety and be a trusted partner in doing that with the corrections practitioners. I'm a partner with the National Resource Center of Justice Involved Women and the PREA Resource Center. Dr. Salisbury talked about the last 50 years. I've ridden 38 of those years, and so I bring many voices and stories with me as I speak. I'm particularly honored to share in this panel with colleagues who've been instrumental in this long journey, particularly to address sexual abuse and confinement. 3 of us worked on major lawsuits 24 years ago addressing these issues. To give people context for that, it was before email, before websites, and before Google. I wish that I could have emailed Judith Resnick during those days or reached out to a Julia Bate. I did find early on the collegiality with Brenda Smith. Though there is still not enough research, there has never been a time that so much research and practitioner-based understanding is available. That's the good news. The question for today is, to what degree does this body of knowledge impact justice for incarcerated women? Is the federal response to women involved in the criminal justice system adequate to spread this knowledge and ensure the administration of justice? My written response provides context and examples that support my position. My position is this: federal assistance has contributed to the development of research, tools, and many training opportunities for correctional staff that support a gendered approach. This was particularly true in the 90s until recent years. But the current federal assistance and focus on women has become very limited, resulting in stalled efforts in creating safety and dignity for the women and staff who serve them. Because of these limited resources, we are losing momentum in the implementation of sorely needed strategies that support justice-involved women and their successes. It is impossible to exaggerate the importance of federal assistance. When federal agencies focus on an issue, it elevates the urgency, or at least makes the statement that it matters. This was true in years of work at the National Institution of Corrections in implementing training and strategies and assisting states with developing laws addressing staff sexual misconduct. The issue became named. This was pre-PREA. We know now that implementation of PREA is taking years. It's social practice that we're changing, but there are many lessons learned that speak to the implementation concerns that Dr. Salisbury has brought forward. Gender responsive principles have been a very important core strategy to work with the field. Those principles were developed because there was federal assistance given to NIC during the time of the early 90s and mid 90s. There are few systems that sustain a management structure that creates continuity in internal advocacy for women, such as Dr. Williams' position in Alabama. It would be difficult to find more than a half dozen strategic plans on a state level for women's services. This is why federal assistance is so important. The National Institute of Corrections has a program called Agency Planning. Teams of practitioners can go to that program and begin developing strategic plans. The NIC has very limited funding to implement that program. Like many professions, senior level staff with expertise are leaving at a rapid rate, and the transfer of knowledge is challenging, particularly when there is such a small number of senior level managers with any knowledge of gender responsive work with women. Wardens assigned to women's facilities are often starting without a knowledge base of any gender responsive approach. Transformative training, which has been referred to around creating a trauma-informed approach, couldn't be more critical. It is not one-off training, and it is not specifically programmatic. All staff and all women in a facility need to be trained in a trauma-informed approach. In addition, operational practice must be considered within that approach. Secondary trauma for staff is real. If we don't train staff and with tools to develop and shift in terms of their own self-care, we have brokenness plus brokenness with the women. Brokenness plus brokenness equals brokenness. This work is critical, and if we want reporting cultures in addressing sexual abuse, we have to have cultures that are hope-based and not fear-based. There are many points I want to make, but I am aware that my time is running out, and I look forward to our questions. What I would like to suggest is some concrete funding recommendations. We recommend funding reinstate the funding for the National Women's Resource Center of Justice-Involved Women, fund NIC to increase outreach to the field, particularly in short-term technical assistance, and allocate targeted technical assistance to implement the PREA standards through a gendered lens, fund research focused on understanding women's relationships in correctional settings, recommend a national meeting and encourage a network of administrators of women's services and key subject matter experts and stakeholders. Provide federal agencies presentations on a gender-responsive model of practice, work with professional organizations such as the Association of State Correctional Administrators, encourage an interagency work group. These issues are critical, but they are also urgent issues. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Moss. Dr. Meyer?
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today. My name is Jamie Meyer. I'm a physician specializing in infectious diseases and addiction medicine. I'm faculty on the Yale AIDS program, and the majority of my clinical work and clinical research is about HIV prevention and treatment for women involved in criminal justice systems. So here's what I see as kind of some key problems. First is that prisons and jails were not designed to deliver health care. And so the missions of prisons to punish, sometimes to rehabilitate, and perhaps to protect public safety are often at odds of the idea of delivering compassionate, comprehensive care to the people in their custody. Secondly, prison systems were designed primarily by and for men, so the unique needs of women are often ignored. One of the many reasons why I'm excited to participate in the briefing today. That being said, the provision of healthcare during incarceration is constitutionally protected under the 8th Amendment, and it says that we cannot practice deliberate indifference to women's needs. And that's really important because women in the criminal justice system have multiple complex medical, psychiatric, and social needs that cannot be ignored. And those needs are more complex than those of men in prison, and they're more complex than those of women in the community. And they include, among many, HIV, chronic hepatitis C, sexually transmitted infections, substance use disorders, psychiatric disorders, particularly post-traumatic stress, and homelessness. And these conditions are not gender neutral. So while the diagnosis and management of some of these conditions might be the same for men and for women, the unique experience of living with these conditions is very different for women. And these conditions need to be addressed during incarceration, both for the individual health of women, but also for public health, because the majority of people return to communities every year. So care for women needs to be evidence-based, and it needs to be equivalent to that available in the community. So let's think about what that might mean in terms of HIV. 1 in 7 people living with HIV in the United States pass through the criminal justice system every year. And twice as many women in prison have HIV than men in prison. And many more experience extraordinary HIV risk because of their substance use and their engagement in high-risk sex in the community. Therefore, people in prison, and women in particular, are a high key target population for HIV prevention, really critical to these goals of ending HIV transmission by 2030 that the President spoke about in his State of the Union address. So the CDC talks about the HIV care continuum, and it says that first people have to be diagnosed with HIV. And that means that on entry into prisons and jails, everyone should receive routine opt-out HIV testing. So they're aware that they're living with HIV and can get treated. But this is rarely done. People who test positive for HIV then need to have care rapidly available and initiated, including treatment with antiretroviral medications. And this is important not only for individual health, but also for public health, because when people have their HIV effectively treated, they are unable to transmit the virus to others. For people who HIV test negative, we need to think of prisons and jails as a moment of opportunity to educate people about HIV prevention. And that means psychoeducational approaches, as well as linkages to HIV prevention medications known as PrEP. Let's think about what evidence-based and equivalent means in terms of substance use disorders. So according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, up to 96% of women in state prisons and 72% of women sentenced in jails meet criteria for severe substance use disorders. Yet fewer than 10% ever receive treatment with medication-assisted therapy, which is evidence-based. Only 14 states currently offer medication-assisted therapy for people in prisons and jails. So care needs to be comprehensive and woman-centered, and that includes screening and diagnosis, supportive care for withdrawal, effective behavioral therapies, and medication-assisted treatment. All of these things packaged together. Abstinence-only approaches do not work. People have very high risk of relapse after return to communities, pretending high risk of overdose, and recidivism. Care also needs to be continuous and integrated. So for chronic health conditions, continuity of care is best maintained when people are out in the community. But when alternatives to care are not possible, care needs to be integrated on intake into prisons and jails, throughout incarceration, including on interfacility transfers, and on transition back to communities. And this means that providers need to have a way to communicate. They need to be able to coordinate care in a way that is seamless. People need continuous access to medications and continuous access to health insurance, particularly on transition back to communities. As many others have talked about, care needs to also be gender responsive. The World Health Organization defines gender responsive care as a quality of care framework that really puts gender at the center of program planning, staff capacity building, access to, participation in, and monitoring of services, and advocacy. And as many others have also talked about, care needs to be trauma-informed. So the majority of women in prisons and jails have experienced lifetime trauma, and that has a very broad impact on their lives. So we need to acknowledge signs and symptoms of trauma and integrate that knowledge into all policies and procedures with particular attention to safety and security to avoid re-traumatizing women, their families, and staff. So just in the couple of seconds I have left here, just say again, my belief is that healthcare for women in prison should be evidence-based, should be equivalent to that available in the community, should be continuous and integrated, gender responsive and trauma informed. And in that way, care is not only made effective, but also meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meyer. Dr. Sufrin?
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to the Commission. My name is Carolyn Suffren. I'm an obstetrician gynecologist and researcher at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. I provided clinical care to incarcerated women, conducted research on their reproductive health care needs, and advised prisons and jails across the country. I'll focus my remarks this morning more specifically on the reproductive health status of and needed healthcare services for incarcerated women. In particular, I want to emphasize that the inadequate reproductive health care that exists for them, coupled with the continued rise and racial disproportionality of incarcerated women, is one of the most flagrant violations of the human rights and equity principles of reproductive justice of our time. Some of the written testimonies cited statistics that 3 to 5% of incarcerated women are pregnant, that 1,500 to 2,000 births happen to women in custody each year. And while my esteemed panelists are citing the only available evidence, the truth is that these statistics are inaccurate. They are decades old and limited in scope and methodology. We actually have no idea how many pregnant incarcerated women there are and what happens to these pregnancies. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention rigorously and routinely collects national statistics on pregnancy outcomes in the US, but their statistics do not account for incarceration status. The Bureau of Justice Statistics rigorously and routinely collects national statistics on incarcerated people and their demographics, but they do not collect any information about pregnancy. This is a profound illusion. Women who don't count don't get counted. That is, the lack of any comprehensive or updated statistics about pregnancy among women behind bars signals the systematic disregard in the carceral system and indeed our country for incarcerated pregnant people. My research team at Johns Hopkins will soon, in 3 weeks, publish the results of a study we conducted from 2016 to 2017 and over 750 live births. But this is only a proportion of the state prisons, as well as all federal prisons. 6% of the pregnancies ended in miscarriage. This paucity of data means that no one is paying attention. Anything can happen to them, as Ms. Wynn vividly and harrowingly described. They can be placed in solitary confinement, shackled. They can receive substandard pregnancy care and nutrition. Their symptoms of contractions or bleeding may be ignored. They can be forced to detox from opioids, even though this violates the clear medical standard of care that they should be on medication-assisted treatment. These are all things that erode their dignity and lead to my patients suffering. While the First Step Act recently banned shackling of pregnant women in federal custody, only 26 states have laws prohibiting the practice. And even when there are laws, it still happens. Among the many medical risks, shackling at any point in pregnancy can increase the risk of falls, which can lead to placental separation, hemorrhage, and stillbirth. During labor and delivery, shackling can interfere with routine and emergency medical interventions when there is fetal distress, maternal hemorrhage, when the baby gets stuck in the birth canal, or if an emergency cesarean section needs to be done. Pregnant women should never be shackled during childbirth. There are numerous well-established medical and psychological benefits to breastfeeding for both moms and babies. Yet only a few prisons enable moms to breastfeed, either through direct contact or pumping breast milk. There are many other unaddressed reproductive and sexual health issues facing incarcerated women. They have high rates, as we have heard, of HIV, sexually transmitted infections like gonorrhea and chlamydia, and these are higher than incarcerated men and non-incarcerated women. They must be screened and appropriately treated. Incarcerated women must also have access to cervical and breast cancer screening and follow-up according to national guidelines, but this is not consistently available. Research has shown that the majority of incarcerated women plan to be sexually active on release and want to avoid pregnancy. Starting birth control in custody can help them prevent unintended pregnancies during reentry, but very few prisons actually have birth control methods available, even though they are often used for medical conditions as well. Emergency contraception is also necessary, though not consistently available, especially for women who are sexually assaulted in custody. At the same time, we also have evidence of coercive contraception practices in prison, such as the over 100 unlawful sterilizations of women in California prisons from 2005 to 2012. Women in prison intentionally have their autonomy stripped from them, and when providing family planning services, this potential for coercion must be thoughtfully incorporated into protocols. For older women in custody, menopausal symptoms like hot flashes, for instance, are hard to endure when you can't control your own environment and when you don't even have access to ice. Transgendered individuals are denied access to hormone therapy and placed in unsafe housing, as we have discussed. While institutions of incarceration are constitutionally mandated to provide health care to incarcerated persons, based on the 1976 Estelle versus Gamble Supreme Court decision, there are no mandatory standards and no mandatory oversight for what those healthcare services are. This is why we have such profound variability in reproductive healthcare services. Services are provided based on the discretion of local administrators, which can also lead to dangerous departures from standards of care. This is alarming. The hospital where I work now would be shut down if it failed its accreditation from the Joint Commission. We must work towards a larger goal of not locking up so many women, especially pregnant ones. But in the meantime, we must ensure that all of these women get quality, comprehensive reproductive health care by doing, among other things, the following. First is to formalize healthcare standards with mandatory accreditation and oversight from a national supervisory entity. Such standards must include pregnancy and postpartum care in accordance with national standards, STI and cancer screenings, and family planning services that include access to reversible contraceptive methods. Second, require all 50 states to pass laws prohibiting solitary confinement and shackles in pregnancy, childbirth, and the postpartum period, and have mandatory trainings to ensure that these laws are actually practiced. And we must also mandate pregnancy statistics data collection through the Bureau of Justice Statistics at least every other year. We must make concrete changes in the healthcare incarcerated women receive to promote dignity and safety for them and to become a more just and civil society. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Ginsburg.
Thank you to the commissioners for inviting me to speak to you today. My name is Betsy Ginsburg, and I'm a clinical law professor and director of the Civil Rights Clinic at Cardozo School of Law. The Civil Rights Clinic at Cardozo engages in litigation on behalf of individuals and groups whose rights have been violated by prison officials. Throughout my 20-year career representing prisoners, I've represented women in cases involving their physical and mental health and sexual assault. I am heartened that the Commission chose to address the issue of women in prison for today's briefing. As we heard this morning, women have been the fastest growing segment of our prison population. But because prisons are closed institutions, they operate far from public scrutiny and without adequate oversight. I was encouraged by the public outcry in response to the recent abuses at the Federal Metropolitan Detention Center in my home borough of Brooklyn. What made that situation unique was not the treatment of the detainees there, but that federal, state, and local lawmakers, a federal judge, and other stakeholders made their way into the institution, talked to detainees there, and saw what was going on. Though I would have liked to have seen similar outrage and attention expressed when just 2 years prior, multiple women were raped by staff at the same jail, and the conditions for women were deemed unconscionable by the National Association of Women Judges. I'm hopeful that attention is now being paid, including by this body. In my time today, I would like to address some of the legal barriers that prevent women from receiving adequate care and the lack of legal protections with respect to health and safety of transgender women in particular. As we've heard today, prisons are designed for men. They aren't designed to provide health care, and women have distinct health care needs. Women in prison derive legal rights to health care from the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, state tort law, and disability discrimination statutes. But despite formal legal protections, women prisoners are frequently denied basic medical care. Both practical and doctrinal barriers make it difficult for them to access the legal system. In order to bring these claims of deprivation of medical care, and I want to address a few of these barriers now. The first is lack of legal representation. Most women in prison who attempt to vindicate their rights to medical care through the legal system do so without counsel. In obvious ways, this limits their ability to vindicate their rights. As someone who reads scores of cases that are litigated by pro se prisoners, I can say without reservation that they fare far worse than counsel plaintiffs with comparable claims. Courts can and should do more to provide resources, including opportunities for limited scope representations. The Prison Litigation Reform Act erected a series of hurdles that apply to prisoners seeking to enforce their rights through the federal courts. Two of these hurdles, the administrative exhaustion provision and the attorney's fees provision, make it particularly difficult for prisoners to have their cases heard in court. Requiring prisoners to exhaust their administrative remedies before going to court allows prison officials to control their access to the courts. They do this by making grievance forms unavailable, making the process complicated and technical, and retaliating against prisoners who file grievances. The attorney's fees provision essentially gut fee shifting that is otherwise available in civil rights actions by drastically reducing the fees that lawyers can recover after bringing a successful prisoner's rights case, which is a provision that further compounds the access to counsel problem. The Eighth Amendment standard places a heavy burden on prisoners to show that prison officials had the requisite intent. This standard allows and even encourages prison officials to remain ignorant of health risks. The subjective standard also allows courts to pay tremendous deference to prison officials, often characterizing a prisoner's Eighth Amendment claim as a disagreement with medical staff that doesn't rise to the level of deliberate indifference. Moreover, the 12,000 women in federal custody are subjected to additional legal hurdles in accessing the courts. Before the Supreme Court's 2017 decision in Ziegler versus Abbasi, it wasn't entirely uncommon for courts to accept Bivens actions brought by prisoners for conditions claims. However, now the Bureau of Prisons and the Department of Justice are routinely seeking to dismiss these cases on the grounds that there should be no legal remedy under the Constitution in these cases. While litigation continues to be an important mechanism for change, it remains a difficult path. Successes are achieved, like last month's injunction against the Virginia Department of Corrections, finding Fluvanna Correctional Center for Women to be providing constitutionally deficient care. But such successes are long, hard-fought battles by large teams of lawyers whose resources don't permit enough replication of these kinds of cases. It's also important that the Commission address the issues involving transgender women. Transgender women, especially transgender women of color, are incarcerated at far higher rates than in the general population. Among abuses that they face are the lack of appropriate medical treatment, gender-based harassment, sexual assault by staff and other prisoners, and gender-based isolated confinement. Trans women are regularly housed in what is termed protective custody, but which is often indistinct from solitary confinement. The severe psychological and physical impact of long-term solitary confinement is well documented and is compounded when an individual is placed in that setting on the heels of a traumatic experience, such as a sexual assault in prison. Our legal system offers one solution to trans women whose health and safety is compromised by the prison system, but access to that system is hard to come by. 2 months ago, a federal court in Idaho granted Adri Edmo a preliminary injunction requiring prison officials to provide her with gender confirmation surgery. The court found that her gender dysphoria to be a serious medical condition, and due to her extreme emotional pain that led her to attempt self-castration, ordered the surgery. But for every Adri Edmo who was represented by a large team of experienced counsel, there are scores of trans women who never file claims, whose claims are dismissed on PLRA exhaustion grounds, or who, typically without the assistance of counsel, are denied treatment on the grounds that their condition is deemed not sufficiently serious or that prison officials did not have sufficient knowledge of her need. In fact, shortly before Ms. Edmo won her case, Serenity Williams, a pro se trans woman in a Louisiana state prison, was denied the very same treatment based on a court's finding that because prison officials had provided her with some treatment in the form of hormones, they could not be found deliberately indifferent. Despite ample evidence that men's prisons are not safe for many trans women, most states will not house trans women in women's prisons. And the federal government, as the chairwoman recently noted, rolled back protections for transgender women in federal prisons. And the new BOP guidelines use biological sex as the initial determinant and only allow for housing by gender identity in the rarest cases. Again, I thank the Commission for its attention to these issues, and I look forward to your questions.
Dr. Smith?
Morning. Good morning. I've been fortunate to work on improving the conditions and circumstances of women in conflict with the law for most of my professional career. And many of the people that I've worked with are on that panel and have reminded me of how old I am. I thank you for the opportunity to testify and appreciate your calling this hearing at this time. I'm testifying today based on my work over the course of more than 30 years as an advocate and lawyer for people in custody. As project director of a national effort to address sexual abuse in custody, co-founder of a settlement house for women in custody, and a commissioner serving for 6 years on the National Prison Rape Elimination Commission, I feel strongly that we must stop talking and start doing. I testify today because I hope that this hearing and these testimonies will result in workable recommendations and actions that improve the material circumstances and conditions of women and girls in custody. I hope that the hearing will also result in a request for funding to implement the efforts that we will all testify about to some degree today. If we are able, as a result of this hearing, to take the actions that are necessary to implement the changes, develop and fund the programs and interventions that we all know will make a difference in the lives of women, men, children, their communities, and our country, then we will have done a very good and important thing today. I will start with my recommendations, then I will talk about the basis for those recommendations in my testimony in the event that I run out of time. First, consistent data collection, qualitative and quantitative, on women's experiences in custodial settings. Second, dedicated funding for incarcerated women's health needs and care, including reproductive and preventive health services, including addiction treatment and services related to women's past trauma and trauma experienced in custodial settings. 3, training for providers of sexual assault and trauma services for meeting the needs of people in custody. 4, create alternatives to imprisonment that address the root causes of women's imprisonment, addiction, trauma, education, and housing instability. 5, equal access for women to educational and vocational opportunities in custody that lead to jobs that provide a living wage. In other words, women should have access to job training paths in custody and outside of custody for more than cleaning, cooking, and sewing. 7, eliminate cross-gender viewing and searching of women by men. Women should not be observed while they shower, dress, use the bathroom, or are unclothed for medical visits. 8, place women in correctional facilities closer to their homes, and invest in visitation and communication programs and technologies that allow women to communicate with their families and support reentry. Studies show that contact with family and other supportive individuals increases the likelihood of successful return to the community and a family remaining intact after imprisonment. In November 2003, I was appointed by then House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi to serve on the National Prison Rape Elimination Commission. I served formally in that capacity until August of 2009, when the commission sunsetted. But even after that time, the commission has continued to work to protect the safety of people in custody from rape. We were also fortunate to be able to submit a letter to the BOP challenging and speaking to our consternation about the change in the transgender policy. What is clear from my work in so many settings and over so many years is that abuse and disrespect for women is a defining feature of our custodial system. Unlike men in custody, women are not going on hunger strikes or taking over institutions that abuse them, as Heather Ann Thompson described in her book, Blood in the Water, about the 1971 Attica prison uprising. That prison revolt led to important prison reforms and commissions. For that reason, women in custody continue to lack the political power to move the needle to gain the treatment they deserve, and thus only receive attention when there is a crisis or scandal generally related to sexual abuse or maltreatment of women based on their reproductive status. In the women prisoners litigation that Julie and I were involved in, we challenged women's access to education and work opportunities. Men in DC prisons could earn a college degree, while women could only earn a GED. Men had access to apprenticeships in plumbing, electrical, and auto repair, while the most that women could aspire to was to work in the kitchen, cleaning, doing laundry, and sewing. So often women traded sex for phone calls, for getting their papers moved, and also for visits or money to send to their family. So, because I want to end on this note, I want to say that women in prison are not just their wombs. They're also their hearts, their heads, their souls, their homes, and their communities. We should be concerned about women's equality and their access to ways to lift themselves out of poverty and out of the exploitative conditions in their homes and communities that often bring them in conflict with the law. Given that, we should not create the same conditions that women experience in the community. We should do this in order to increase their likelihood of success upon return to their community and to enhance their ability to contribute to the community upon their release. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to open for questions from my fellow commissioners. And just to say at the outset that I know Commissioner Narasaki has a hard stop at 12:10, and so is going to need to head out. So if she leaves and we are still ongoing with the panel, she's not commenting on what you've presented. But Commissioner Yaki, do you want to start us?
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Thank all of you for coming here. I have a few years ago, back when I was a law student, that must have been about 2 years ago, I actually did a trial on the Eighth Amendment, on deliberate indifference in a medical facility, Cheshire, actually in Connecticut. And I've always been fascinated by this issue going forward. One of the things that came up then, and even when I was working for Nancy Pelosi as her chief of staff, we were discussing the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and I brought up the issue of the training of, there's one thing about access, or part of the access is access to quality medical personnel. And I'm wondering, what is the status right now of the certification process for someone to become a doctor in a prison system? Because it used to be pretty low. I don't know if it's changed or not, but you got people who would not be able to be certified at the state level, be able to practice medicine in a prison. Has that changed? Are there still concerns about the quality of the medical personnel who are available to answer the call of these folks who are here? I see a lot of people nodding up and down, so please have at it.
So the answer is it depends, which is the case with any question and answer about healthcare for incarcerated people because of this lack of standardization.
I think your microphone is not on. I'm sorry. If you could just put that there.
Oh, sorry. So the answer is that it depends, as with any question or answer about healthcare for incarcerated people, because of this lack of standardization and lack of oversight. And there are several questions folded into yours. One is, how does a physician get hired to practice in a prison setting? And my understanding is that they do need to have an active medical license. I do not know what happens at the level of the state board of medical licensure in terms of, and the prison that's hiring them, or sometimes it's not actually the Department of Corrections that's hiring them, but it's a privately contracted healthcare organization. I do not have enough knowledge myself on how the hiring practices happen to ensure that they are able to practice medicine, but I know that it still happens that some of the people who get hired have licenses that have been revoked or they're on probation. But in terms of quality of care, it's even if you have a valid license and you haven't been put on probation, there are so many other elements that determine the quality of care. One is respect. And this is a group of people who are systematically disregarded and disrespected and there's a lot of stigma and they receive a lot of judgments. Now, there are many wonderful healthcare providers in prisons across the country, but then there are others who cultivate their own judgments and assume a lot of the punitive aspects of the culture in which they're working. In addition, sometimes people are not adequately trained in the problems that they're going to be seeing.
That's what I was going to ask. Is there, for example, a requirement that a physician be an OBGYN when they're practicing at a prison?
No. There are several types of trained professionals who I would consider to be qualified to take care of pregnant people: OBGYNs, family physicians, certified nurse midwives, and then certain nurse practitioners and physician assistants who have received specialized training. However, that is consistently not available to people, to pregnant people. And I have been an expert witness on cases where, pregnant women have reported symptoms like vaginal bleeding. And I know as an obstetrician, any vaginal bleeding in pregnancy can be a sign of danger, even if it's just a little bit. It can be a sign of an ectopic pregnancy, of preterm labor, of many other things. And when I saw this record, it said the nurse said, "Oh, you're not soaking a pad an hour, you're fine." Or in another similar case, the nurse said, "Oh, that bleeding you're having is a result of the antibiotic you were prescribed for your urinary tract infection," which actually has absolutely no connection. So even when people have appropriate licensure, they may not be appropriately trained in caring for this particular problem. There are prisons and jails that house pregnant people that do not have emergency delivery kits on site. And while we certainly hope that someone doesn't give birth in a prison, if their labor is fast or if their symptoms are ignored, that might happen. And it costs $30. You can order it from Amazon. And yet there are prisons that don't have emergency delivery kits or someone who knows how to use it.
I might add that not every person who delivers healthcare in a prison needs to be a physician employed by a Department of Corrections, that there are a lot of different models of care out there that could be employed and are quite evidence-based and effective, but they are rarely employed. So they include using community-based providers to come into facilities and deliver care. That also provides nice continuity of care. So when people leave facilities, they can go back to those community providers. Some places like Connecticut, where Connecticut Department of Corrections currently uses telemedicine to deliver some type of specialized care. So that, has pros and cons, but it is possible to do some sort of routine, high quality care remotely that can be cost effective for systems and sort of more feasible to implement. And the other idea is that not all healthcare providers need to be MDs or DOs, that they could certainly be mid-level practitioners like nurse practitioners or physician's assistants who are often very well versed and very experienced in delivering high quality care, and the care can be delivered in a more cost effective way.
Does that depend on whether there's access to quality facilities in that area? I mean, if you're in the middle of nowheresville, I shouldn't say it quite like that, but a lot of these prisons are located in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
Access to ancillary facilities is a lot more problematic. So the ability to have a community provider or whatever to come in and rotate in seems to me to be a little bit of a problem.
Right, definitely. And it's even more of a problem if women have to be transported out to those providers out in the community, which can be a threat to their personal safety.
Professor Smith, go ahead.
If I may, and I think it was actually the ending comment about transportation. Women have problems being transported from their housing units, sometimes even up to the medical care that's in the facility. And obviously, if children are not being delivered or if there's specialty care and they have to be moved off ground, oftentimes those women are shackled. Right. And they may have to wait for very long periods of time to actually be transported. And so you can often have a situation where women will decide, you know what, I'm just not going to go at this particular period in time because I'm going to be waiting for 8 hours. I may not have food during that time. And so there's actually an interaction between transportation, between the policies that exist within prisons, and also the effect on the access to healthcare.
So it's an indirect barrier to access.
Yes.
Yeah. Commissioner Narasaki? And also, if I could just let folks know, please turn your microphone off when you're not speaking because we only have so many that can be on and audible at the same time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Professor Smith, in your written testimony, you mentioned that the Violence Against Women Act specifically prohibits services and funding for services for anyone with a history of a felony. How did that come about, and are there efforts to change that?
So when initially enacted, that was the situation. There's recently been changes to the Violence Against Women Act, which do allow the use of those resources for people in custody. And in fact, some of the funding that the PREA Resource Center has been giving out has been specifically to sort of change the culture specifically around working with people who are actually defendants and who are in custody. Because I think initially the notion was that those who were proponents of the Violence Against Women Act wanted to make sure that that money was not being given to batterers or people who had actually assaulted women. But I think our further understanding of victimization has allowed us to know that there are victims both inside custody and outside of custody, and that often there's a trajectory or a move of women who've been victimized in the custody to actually end up in custody as well. And so those restrictions are no longer there, but those agencies still continue to struggle with providing those services.
Thank you. And Ms. Abate, various witnesses have said that CRIPA is not being used enough. Do you think it is? If not, why? And what would you recommend changing?
I agree that CRIPA is absolutely not being used enough. I think that I'm not sure exactly why. It's always a matter of prioritization. Whenever any new person comes into the Attorney General's office or one of those higher level offices, and I'm not talking about a different party, any particular party, even same party, changes within the same party, you're going to have a different focus. And you can see that if you look at the CRIPA reports that have been prepared for Congress every year. For example, in the Bush administration, there was a huge focus on conditions of confinement in juvenile facilities. You will see that there have been none of those cases for the last 6, 7, 8 years. Because of different focuses on within this a specific statute. And so the special litigation section has a number of statutes, and one of them is the section 14141, otherwise known as police misconduct statute. So there's only been so many folks in the special litigation section, and people have their different focuses, and there was a huge focus on police misconduct for the past however many years, rightfully so. And just as a reality, that means that resources are going to be drawn from someplace else. And women prisoners in particular are often overlooked in these cases as well. I think that anybody who wants to focus on women prisoners, there has to be a system in place to do that. Like there needs to be a system in place in agencies where someone's overseeing women's populations. Like what you all are doing now, this is a briefing on women in prison. If this were a briefing on prison or people in prison, you'd have one person out of, I don't know, 40, and that one voice would be powerful, but it would be so diminished by the rest of the other equally powerful voices with equally powerful concerns, and they're competing, and they're both important, and they all need to be heard. So just as that happens out in society, just as that happens in agencies, so too in the Department of Justice, so too in the special litigation section. And until there's a continued focus, not just on prisoners, but women prisoners, I don't think it will change.
Thank you. You had also mentioned, I think it was in your written testimony, that PREA doesn't have an enforcement mechanism. So do you recommend one?
I'm not sure if I recommend one. I'm not sure. You can't legislate or mandate cultural change. I think it's going to be a process. I think the more that folks can be helped along in that manner, the better. I've seen cultures that have been really problematic and really abusive and really awful for women change dramatically. You'll hear about that this afternoon. And those cultures have changed based on implementing gender-informed, gender-responsive, trauma-informed care. It takes time. But imagine if we could use those principles and take those principles based on implementation of the PREA standards, using them in women's prisons, and do that before there's an issue, before there's a huge scandal, before there's a huge litigation. Because we know it's a problem, we know it happens, we know it can happen in any facility, and we know how to fix it. So we can do that now without waiting for litigation, without waiting for another modification to this, that, or the other federal statute to pass. We know what to do. We know how to do it. And so we should.
I just have one last question. So everyone mentions the problem with solitary confinement, and sometimes it's provided as protective. And sometimes we got a lot of testimony about how women who've given birth get put into solitary confinement. I don't understand why, what the rationale is for that. And what would be the alternatives? Is it just that the rationales given for solitary confinement are not valid? Is there need for alternatives, or is it enough that if you did training and you had the trauma-induced approaches that you would eliminate the need for there to be that kind of punishment?
I think, unless anyone else wants to jump in, that all of those things are important, and it all comes down to treating women in a trauma-informed way, understanding that certain things will trigger a reaction in a woman, so avoiding those instances or reacting to them, modeling the behavior you want to see instead of mirroring the behavior that's coming at you, and treating women with respect. I hope that Dr. Williams will testify today about how many women have been in her solitary confinement restrictive housing section, because even though I'm no longer working on that case in Tutwiler, I was thrilled to get an email from her over the summer that it was a screenshot of her list of women who were in segregation, and there was nobody there. There was nobody there. And that was not a part of any of the settlement agreement. Nothing was mentioned about don't put women in seg. That was a result of them implementing gender responsive and trauma-informed discipline over a period of time, preventing the need for any type of discipline and using the least amount of discipline that's necessary to get the point across to women. And you don't need that much. And it's certainly different for men. So that's been my experience.
I would agree with Julie, because I think that when you have a hammer, everything is a nail. And I think that often it's either one, A or Z in corrections, but to the extent that there's training, that there's support of the kind that folks have received as a result of litigation, right? Because often I have to say some of the best folks in corrections I know have actually said, please sue me so that I can actually get access to services and resources, because they're actually folks who want to do the right thing. But unfortunately, they only get that when there is a crisis. And it should not be that, right? It shouldn't be that Tutwiler actually was able to become better and to have no women in segregation as a result of having to be sued.
Ms. Moss?
Now you're on. What I'd like to speak to is also, by and large, women who are in solitary or restrictive housing. One of the things we don't talk enough about or understand is so much of it is around, quote, girlfriend fights and women's relationships with each other that are in a range from close friendships to partners. And it's a very strong dynamic within women's prisons. And so I think that if we could be more deliberate about studying women in relationships and with some of the programming, having women really understand their own issues around boundaries with each other and healthy relationships, but the staff doesn't really know what to do with that often. And so it's correct that if the hammer is the only thing there, out of frustration, staff use it. The other thing that we have to be aware of, if we really understand the corrections environment, is we are in one of the most severe staff crisis that we've ever been in corrections. So maybe Dr. Williams can speak to it, but I'm working with several major women's prisons right now where there's a 50% vacancy rate with staff. And that 50% vacancy rate is devastating. So we may implement good programming, implement trauma-informed care, but if we can't sustain it, then it's very difficult. That's why I wanted to mention the secondary trauma that staff have, because they're so stretched out. And then if they also don't have the training, then that's when you see the overuse of restrictive housing.
Thank you. Madam Vice Chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. This question arises based on a newspaper article that I read a couple of days ago in my state newspaper. It's the story of a post-operative transgender prisoner that's been sentenced to roughly 10 years in prison, and she's recognized by her birth name, a male name, but that name, she legally changed it. But she says that she's required to change clothes and shower in view of male inmates, despite having had her breasts augmented and male genitalia removed, that she's regularly issued men's undergarment. After some period of complaining, she has in fact been provided hormones, that she's subject to harassment from the men, no sexual assault or anything, but that she lives in constant fear. And so my question for Professor Smith and Professor Ginsburg and Ms. Moss and any others that might want to weigh in, what should any advocate for her be doing to assist? This is a current situation. It's ongoing.
So I think what you're describing is a fairly common experience of trans women in prison. They're frequently misgendered by prison officials. They're treated poorly. They're harassed and worse. And I think, the first thing I would do advocating with someone like that is talk to them about where they would feel safe. And I think that's what the prison is required to do. And so for some people, it may be that the only place that person's going to feel safe is in a women's prison.
And that's what she has expressed.
And there is precedent. And in fact, in Illinois, a trans woman was just moved into a women's prison, and it's happened in that state before, where she was assaulted and harassed repeatedly prior to that. But of course, it shouldn't have to be that the only time a trans woman gets placed into a women's prison is after a sexual assault. It should obviously happen before that sexual assault. But, every person is different and everybody's needs are different. But the prison officials should be working with those women to figure out how they can safely and humanely house them.
I would also add that it's really important that we prepare the population and the staff, because I think when we're
at the
facility, receiving facility, because I think we've also seen the experience where the women in population were very uncomfortable, and often we implement these policies or practices and don't really prepare people. And I think we can do a whole lot more work in both inmate orientations, but programmatic areas where we could really do a lot more around education, not just for the staff, but also for the population.
Professor Smith?
Yep, I'd only add that I think that what you're hearing is, again, the hammer and the nail situation. Corrections has traditionally not done well with providing for the individualized needs of people in custody. And so the situation that you're describing is one that would require individualized attention, and I think, as all of my panelists have, all of the panelists who've spoken have said, would actually require some training specific to that particular situation, and also the ability to be flexible in situations that are not all the same. And I think that that kind of flexibility is not common often in institutional settings. And I think that that we need to have more resources to work specifically on, I think, some of those harder and tougher issues. I think that the history of all of the litigation around trans women in custody in particular has been a history of very, very long litigation, which has often involved self-injury by those individuals, even before they're able to get access to hormone therapy, to wear clothes that are consistent with their gender, to be called by the pronouns that they want to be referred to by. And so I think that this is a situation that continues to require additional attention and resources. And unfortunately, what you've described will be repeated again and again.
And in all fairness to the state system, they're aware of it and they say that they're looking into it. So that suggests that they're taking the time to give it the attention and to come up with some kind of individualized, result. Thank you. Yes.
Sorry, I was just going to add that there are certainly the social and cultural and legal and psychological aspects of being a trans woman in prison that everyone has mentioned. There's also the medical aspects, recognizing, having providers who are able to recognize and diagnose gender dysphoria disorder and to manage it effectively with hormone therapy. That means people need continuous access to their medications, throughout their incarceration and on release.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Chladni.
So many questions, so little time. Ms. Moss, one of the things I've noticed, at least so far, is that the standards seem to be very flexible, although other things are not. Is there some way that professional organizations, I know in the law we have like ideal statutes or, whatever. Is there any way some professional organizations can get together and decide what standards should be used for BFOQs for certain staffing positions, medical care, medical decisions, medical equipment needed in infirmaries, mental health care, things like that? Because or how many, medical staff is needed to treat X amount of women?
Right. You're very good at multiple questions, I noticed.
Well, I got to ask them when I can.
Yeah. So let me just say, I feel very strongly that the strategies to make this all better are there and not utilized. And what I mean by that is, for instance, and I'm sure Director Birch will speak to this, the Association of State Directors of Corrections, the 50 states and the territories and urban settings that belong to that, they do look at how to standardize particular practices. They share practices with each other. I know that Yale works with them on restrictive housing, but there is a receptiveness right now to what works and what do we need to have the courage to do to work in this area. And so I think progress can be made by using existing professionals' opportunities. Certainly, the medical folks on this panel know those, those standards and environments where that can be true too. The National Correctional Healthcare Association, the American Correctional Association is our major industry professional organization, along with American Jail Association, the American Probation Parole Association. We do not really take advantage of the capacity building that can happen with leaders in those associations. You often see very little presentations on women offenders in some of those conferences and so forth. I know that there is a receptiveness. I think we can explode that more. The issue that I feel so strongly about around federal assistance is we have some wonderful tools. You heard Dr. Salisbury this morning, but there are other tools. There's one that's a safety scale developed by Drs. Wells and Owen that we used at Tutwiler that actually looks at safety per housing unit around physical, emotional, sexual safety. And from that, you can really target how to create cultures of safety. So I think connecting these associations with tools that exist and with the information we do know can be done. We have to be strategic. And what has slowed down really is the lack of funding that has been present to do some of that work.
I'd like to speak about the potential for standardization and medical societies. So the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists offers guidance for what services should be provided, reproductive health care services should be provided in prisons and jails. The American Correctional Association does have a healthcare arm that does have some standards, and they do offer an accreditation program, although the standards they have that relate to reproductive health care are very thin. The National Commission on Correctional Health Care was founded in 1983. It started as a pilot project from the American Medical Association. And the NCCHC, which is a nonprofit, it accredits healthcare facilities in jails and prisons, and it accredits facilities that meet its rigorous standards that include details about what kinds of services should be provided, staffing ratios, the safety of the healthcare environment, pharmacy formularies. They're very extensive. So there actually already is a system and a model in place for accreditation. Requiring this as a national standard would not be reinventing the wheel. And it's not to say that the NCCHC's system is perfect. It certainly could use some improvement, but it is fairly robust. And the standards that they publish and that they accredit based on are reviewed and revised every 2 to 3 years. But it is voluntary to be accredited, and less than 1/3 of prisons and jails in this country are accredited by the National Commission on Correctional Health Care. I also should probably have the disclaimer, I serve on the board of the NCCHC as the liaison for the American College of OBGYNs. The views I expressed just now are my own and not the organization's.
Ditto.
Thank you. Dr. Meyer, you do infectious diseases, and all these women that are incarcerated, at least in the federal system, are getting out of prison. I think most all of them. And if all of them have an infectious disease and you're treating HIV, which other ones do you treat and which ones don't you treat in your capacity?
Okay, so I should say that I practiced HIV care and hepatitis C care. I served as an infectious disease consultant for the Connecticut Department of Corrections up until 2016, when they took over all their own healthcare and healthcare delivery and no longer ferreted that out to our group. So yes, a very high proportion of women in prison have are living with HIV, so 2.6%, which seems small, but that's about 5 to 7 times higher than the prevalence of HIV in surrounding communities. Many more experience HIV risk. Hepatitis C, also extremely common, especially among women. Women are 1.5 times more likely than men in prison to screen positive for hepatitis C. That condition is rarely treated during incarceration. So only about 14 out of 49 surveyed state prisons and jails, 14 states actually screen for hepatitis C at all, never mind treat it. So fewer than 1% of people living with hepatitis C ever get it treated while they're incarcerated. And yes, that definitely means that on return back to communities, they can unwittingly continue to transmit to others. And part of the reason why women in prison are really a key target population for prevention. Other infectious diseases, we talk about sexually transmitted infections. Women in prisons much more likely to experience chlamydia, gonorrhea, latent syphilis. All of these things are completely treatable, even with penicillin, you know, but it's, if you don't look for it, you don't treat it.
And do prisons look for it, or
No.
is it the 14 that you were talking about?
So the 14 screen for hepatitis C, you know, 17 states routinely screen for HIV. That's not so many. And not everyone receives routine screening for sexually transmitted infections on entry either, which is a travesty because it's very easily treatable and, you know, and has profound consequences, not only for public health, as we're talking about, but for individual health if it goes untreated.
And if you could talk about, you did talk briefly in your statement about MAT and the lack of it. Why do prisons choose not to treat with medication and require people to go cold turkey, so to say? That was a term from my generation.
I get it. Yeah, so I'll just say medication-assisted therapy, for those of you who don't know, is an evidence-based method of treating substance use disorders, highly effective, not available for all substance use disorders, but certainly for opioids and alcohol, which is like the primary substance use disorders that most people in prison experience. Rarely available, includes for opioids, for example, methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone. So the issue that facilities often face is that methadone, by federal requirements, a facility that is delivering methadone needs to be federally licensed to deliver methadone. And so many prisons and jails, whether it's a cost issue or time, energy, effort, interest, don't become licensed. Now, outside facilities that are licensed can come into the facility in prisons and jails and deliver methadone, but this is also rarely done. It's happening more, but doesn't happen much. Buprenorphine, you don't need any special license to do. Physicians, I have one, physicians can apply to have a DEA waiver to prescribe buprenorphine. You don't need any special, you know, other than that, you don't need any special training or anything to deliver buprenorphine, and it's highly effective. So I think there's the lack of interest and energy and sort of, it's a belief issue.
That is the standard today, is treatment with medication, not to completely get off the drug. I mean, that's ideal, but it doesn't happen. Is that correct?
Yes. So the standard is a combination of medication-assisted therapy with behavioral therapy. So sort of a comprehensive approach, and people aren't getting that at all in prisons and jails.
And Ms. Abate,
This is your last one.
I know this is my last question.
Yes, sir.
Your first last question.
Let me ask all 5 of them in one question.
All right, I'm ready.
My question is, would the litigation changes have occurred in Alabama without the power of the consent decree? And do you think that is the consent decree bar that's currently in effect affects that litigation today?
No and no. So no, I don't think that the changes would have been sparked without federal intervention. But no, I don't think that the consent decree bar today should have any effect on that or on other future settlements. And the reason is,
No, I'm talking about future, current, excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt, but
no, for future cases, right? No, because the reason that I think the reason that Tutwiler has been successful is not because the piece of paper says consent decree or settlement agreement. The reason that Tutwiler has been successful is because that jurisdiction, that women's division has owned their change. They've had the consent decree behind them to say, hey, look, we have to do this. They are the people that Professor Smith was talking about who say, hey, come, they didn't, but hey, come sue me, we need some changes. They totally didn't. But right. But my point is, those are the same type of people. Those are the type of people that are in corrections agencies and facilities all across the country who want to do what they know is right and what they know works. And they are rolling a boulder uphill in the mud, knee deep, and just facing challenge after challenge. And so oftentimes it is nice to have that in there. To make the change meaningful, there has to be a culture change. And that doesn't matter what form a settlement agreement takes, whether it's court enforceable, not court enforceable. You get a court enforceable consent decree, people aren't doing what they're supposed to do. You get a federal judge to say, do what you're supposed to do. You're in the same place. You're nowhere better off. You've got to get the buy-in. You've got to make sure the consent decree is workable. The remedies work for the facility. Timelines are workable. And that's the only way you can get it to change when you're talking about culture change, about sexual abuse in women's facilities.
I realize that we're over time, but I just wanted to follow up on that. I found very compelling in your written statement the information that you included about your expectation that open investigations at DOJ should have concluded but have not yet concluded. And I wonder if you can give us information for those of us who don't stand in your shoes. We're not working there at the time that you were, how we would know to expect that those investigations should have concluded and what suppositions we can draw from the fact that they have not.
So I think that one public indicator of progress of cases are those yearly CRIPA reports. They're organized very strangely because they talk about cases filed and settlements, but the first step is an investigation. After an investigation becomes findings. After findings comes negotiation and hopefully settlement, or file a case. Sometimes you file a case and a settlement at the same time if you want it to be court enforceable, Rule 41 stuff, without being an actual consent decree, so you can avoid that stigma for the jurisdiction. I think just be aware of how long things have been opened. If you see something that findings have come out for an investigation, they will say when the investigation opened. Do the math, how many months does it take? Is there anything that started before those findings came out? Because those are the ones that are the stragglers, and there are some definite stragglers.
Thanks very much. We are past time, so I thank this panel for your testimony and your expertise, and we very much appreciate it. We will return at 1:10 to begin our third panel. Thank you.